Before we start, make sure you're warm, safe, and settled. No need to stay awake. This is your permission to doze off. You can also let us know in the comments where in the world you currently are and what time it is for you. In the bustling heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates did their best to keep the desert at bay, the cities of Sumer were like the Vegas of their day, minus the neon lights, but with a lot more ziggurats. These towering structures were the epicenters of a society that knew how to throw a party that could make any modern music festival look like a garden tea party. Yes, the Sumerians were masters of the art of celebration, and their festivals were the main events. Now, you might be wondering why these ancient folks were so keen on festivities. Well, picture life in Sumer around 2100 BCE. You've got scorching heat, the occasional flood, and a workload that's more backbreaking than trying to decode tax forms. Festivals weren't just a fun distraction, they were crucial. They were as essential as bread and beer, literally. Bread and beer were staples of the Mesopotamian diet, and these festivals were a blend of religious devotion and social necessity. Let's start with the religious bit, the gods. Sumerians had a god for everything: love, war, the harvest, you name it. And each city had its own patron deity. To keep these divine beings happy, the people organized grand festivals. The Akitu festival, for instance, was a New Year celebration dedicated to the god Marduk in Babylon. It wasn't just about ringing in the new year with a bang, it was about ensuring the gods would bless the land with fertility, peace, and lots of barley for that all-important beer. But let's be real, it wasn't just piety driving these events. These festivals were also a social glue. They were the ancient version of a networking event, minus the awkward small talk and name tags. Picture thousands of people gathering, feasting, and yes, probably complaining about the weather. These gatherings were a chance for people from different parts of the region to come together, exchange goods, stories, and maybe a little gossip. They also served as an opportunity to show off the wealth and power of the cities, as hosting a successful festival was a matter of civic pride. Now, organizing such a shindig was no small feat. The logistics of feeding thousands of hungry Mesopotamians make the catering at Coachella look like child's play. Records suggest that during the festival of the goddess Inanna, the temple would provide enough food to feed over 10,000 people. That's a lot of barley, dates, and lamb. And let's not forget the beer. Ancient Mesopotamians were serious about their brews. Archaeologists have found that the average daily ration for a worker included about a litre of beer. So, multiply that by thousands, and you've got yourself a river of brew worthy of Dionysian approval. Speaking of approval, it wasn't just the gods who needed to be impressed. The political landscape was just as demanding. These festivals were opportunities for rulers to solidify their power, win over the populace, and maybe even intimidate a rival city or two. Picture a king standing atop a ziggurat, surveying the masses and thinking, yes, this will do nicely. It was a power play wrapped in a party. But let's not romanticize too much. For all their splendor, these festivals were hard work, especially for those behind the scenes. The priests, the cooks, the brewers each had a role to play, and their efforts ensured that everything ran smoothly. And while the upper echelons might have been enjoying the festivities, the workers were probably too busy to partake in the fun. It's a tale as old as time. The party's great if you're a guest, not so much if you're on the clock. In essence, these festivals were the lifeblood of Mesopotamian cities. They were a complex fusion of devotion, politics, and community, held together by the promise of divine favor and the prospect of a good time. So, the next time you're at a music festival, surrounded by thousands of people and wondering why you're there, just remember, you're participating in a tradition that's as old as civilization itself. And while the gods might not be watching, the social media likes surely are. And speaking of traditions, let's dive into Akitu, the Mesopotamian New Year celebration that makes our Times Square shenanigans look like a group of friends awkwardly counting down to midnight in their living room. The Akitu festival was no mere weekend binge. It was a 10-day cultural marathon that combined religious fervor with the kind of pageantry that would make Hollywood green with envy. First off, this wasn't just about popping a few bottles of champagne. No, this was about cosmic order, baby. The Mesopotamians believed that every year the universe needed a little reboot, and Akitu was the festival that hit the refresh button. The idea was to reenact the myth of Marduk, the Babylonian god who defeated chaos. That's right. They were literally staging a heavenly play to make sure the universe stayed on track. Think of it as an annual performance review for reality itself. Now, let's talk about the main event, the king. If you think your New Year's resolutions are tough, try being a Mesopotamian king during Akitu. The festival kicked off with a ritual humiliation of the monarch. The high priest would strip the king of his regalia and smack him in the face. Yes, you heard right. A royal slap to keep the ruler humble and remind him he wasn't above the gods. Who knew cosmic order came with a side of royal roast? But don't feel too bad for the king. This ritual slap was followed by a few days of R&R, ritual and reverence. The king's role was to lead processions, offer sacrifices, and recite sacred texts to ensure Marduk's continued favour. Lucky for him, the slap was more of a symbolic gesture to appease the gods and keep the king's ego in check. After all, power unchecked could lead to chaos, and nobody wanted that, especially not when the stability of the cosmos was apparently hanging in the balance. The festival wasn't just about keeping the king grounded, it was also a showcase of Babylonian bling. The city would be decked out in its finest, with processions that included statues of gods parading through the streets. Picture a parade where the floats are replaced with massive gilded idols. The city's wealth and piety were on full display, a not-so-subtle reminder to neighbours about who was calling the shots in the region. Of course, behind the pomp and ceremony there was a whole lot of logistics. Feeding and hosting thousands of people for 10 days wasn't just about divine favour, it was an economic powerhouse. The festival brought in merchants, traders, and visitors from across the region, transforming Babylon into a bustling hub of activity. This wasn't just a religious event, it was an economic engine that fueled trade and reinforced Babylon's status as a cultural capital. And let's not skip over the entertainment. There were no iPhones or Netflix, but the Mesopotamians knew how to keep the crowd entertained. Music, dancing, and feasting were integral parts of the festival, with enough food and drink flowing to rival any modern-day Oktoberfest. Beer, again, was the drink of choice. Remember, we're talking about a society where the average labourer's daily ration included a litre of the stuff. So it's safe to say anyone who attended Akitu was in for a good time. But amidst the revelry, Akitu was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and order. The festival was a way for the Babylonians to confront chaos, remind themselves of their place in the universe, and reassert their social hierarchy. The king might get a slap, but he was still the one leading the charge against disorder. In a world where the Tigris and Euphrates could flood unpredictably and political fortunes could shift overnight, Akitu was a way to impose some semblance of control, both divine and earthly. All in all, Akitu was a masterclass in fake it till you make it. By acting out the cosmic battle between order and chaos, the Babylonians not only reinforced their beliefs, but also built a shared identity. It was a time when myth and reality blurred, and everyone from the king to the commoner played a role in keeping the universe on track. Just imagine the kind of pressure that puts on your annual performance review. So, the next time you're grumbling about New Year's resolutions or nursing a hangover from your midnight revels, spare a thought for those ancient Babylonians who were partying with a purpose. Because while you might be promising to hit the gym more often, they were out there trying to keep the cosmos from imploding. Cheers to that. As the Babylonians were busy keeping the universe from going belly up, their neighbours in Sumer were diving headfirst into a festival that was all about love, war, and everything in between. Enter the Ishtar festival, a celebration that entwined the passions of the heart with the chaos of conflict, and did so with a flair that would make even the most jaded modern-day Cupid blush. Ishtar, or Inanna, if you're hanging out in Sumer, was the ultimate multitasker of the divine realm. She was the goddess of love and war, a cosmic powerhouse who embodied the paradoxes of human emotion. Picture her as the original diva with a penchant for both romance and a good battlefield brawl. And the festival dedicated to her? Well, let's just say it put our Valentine's Day to shame, minus the overpriced roses and heart-shaped chocolates. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill love fest. The Ishtar festival was a riotous affair held around the spring equinox when life was blooming and the air was thick with, well, potential. It was an ancient Tinder in full swing, but instead of swiping right, participants engaged in ritualistic activities that blurred the lines between sacred and profane. And while we might light a candle or two for ambience, the Sumerians took their rites to another level. Think more along the lines of fertility dances and temple rituals that would make even the most liberal modern gatherings seem like a Sunday school picnic. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Ishtar festival was the sacred marriage rite. This wasn't just an excuse for a party, it was a symbolic union between the king and the goddess, represented by a high priestess. Imagine a ceremony where the stakes are higher than any reality TV wedding you've ever cringed at. The king and the priestess would perform rituals that symbolized the divine blessing of the land's fertility. It was believed that this union would ensure the prosperity of the crops and the people, a critical concern when your survival depended on the whims of the Tigris and Euphrates. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. While the myth portrays a harmonious union, the reality was likely a bit more pragmatic. This ritual was as much about political power as it was about divine favor. By associating himself with Ishtar, the king reinforced his divine right to rule, effectively saying, "Hey, I'm not just your leader. I'm the chosen one by the gods themselves." It was ancient PR at its finest spin that would make any modern political strategist proud. Beyond the temple walls, the festival was a community affair. Think of it as a city-wide block party where everyone's invited, and the price of admission is your willingness to let loose. Music, feasting, and dancing spilled out into the streets, creating an atmosphere charged with anticipation and excitement. This was a time when social norms were temporarily set aside and the usual constraints loosened, kind of like Mardi Gras, but with more divine oversight and fewer beads. And while love was in the air, so was the reminder of war. Ishtar's dual nature meant that the festival also commemorated the tumult of battle. This wasn't just about celebrating love's sweet embrace, it was also a nod to the raw, unbridled power of conflict. Military parades and displays of martial prowess were common, serving as both a tribute to the goddess's warlike aspect and a not-so-subtle display of the city's own military strength. After all, when your neighbours might show up uninvited with an army, it pays to flaunt your defences. Now, you might be wondering what all this revelry cost. Well, hosting a festival of this magnitude wasn't cheap. Records indicate that vast quantities of food and drink were consumed, requiring careful planning and a healthy treasury. It wasn't just about feeding the masses, it was about showcasing the city's wealth and ensuring that the gods and the people were pleased. A successful festival could solidify a ruler's reputation and strengthen alliances, both divine and earthly. Of course, we can't forget the human element. While the myths paint a picture of divine blessings and celestial unions, the reality for many was probably a lot less glamorous. Behind the scenes, an army of workers toiled to keep the festival running smoothly. Cooks, musicians, and artisans worked tirelessly to ensure that the celebrations went off without a hitch. And while the elite enjoyed the fruits of their labour, the common folk were often too busy working to partake in the fun. It's a tale as old as time. The rich get the party, the rest get the clean-up. So, was the Ishtar festival a romantic celebration of love, or a pragmatic exercise in political and social cohesion? Like most things in history, it was a bit of both. It was a time when myths became reality, and reality was infused with myth, a delicate dance between the sacred and the mundane. And while we might chuckle at the notion of a wedding between a king and a goddess, the festival's legacy is a reminder that love and war have always been two sides of the same coin, spinning through the ages. In the end, the Ishtar festival was a celebration of life's dualities, a recognition that love and war, passion and conflict are intertwined in the human experience. So, the next time you find yourself caught up in the chaos of a holiday or simply navigating the battlefield of everyday life, remember the Sumerians who celebrated these very themes with a fervour that defied the ages. Because while the gods might no longer walk our streets, their stories and the lessons they impart are still very much alive. Now, as those Sumerians were busy blending love and war into a festival cocktail that would leave even Aphrodite and Ares raising their eyebrows, let's open up the ledger books and see what these festivals really cost. Because, spoiler alert, putting on a bash that kept both gods and mortals happy was less about divine intervention and more about cold, hard economics. First off, these festivals weren't funded by some celestial GoFundMe. They required serious resources. Imagine the logistics of feeding, housing, and entertaining thousands of people for days on end. You think planning your cousin's wedding was stressful? Try coordinating a multi-day feast where the guests expect more barley and ale than a frat party on homecoming weekend. According to some ancient tablets, a single festival could chew through an estimated 100,000 litres of beer and 10,000 loaves of bread. And that's just the basics. Add in lamb, dates, fresh produce and spices, and you're looking at enough calories to fuel an army, literally. The need for such a bounty meant that festivals weren't just religious or cultural phenomena, they were economic juggernauts. They created a ripple effect through the economy that would make Canes smile. Farmers, herders and brewers had to ramp up production, which meant more work for labourers, more trade for merchants, and more coin flowing through the market than you could shake a shekel at. These gatherings were the ancient version of an economic stimulus package, pumping life into the local economy with the vigour of a Red Bull-fuelled sprinter. Now, about that grain supply chain talk, about a well-oiled machine. Grain was the lifeblood of Mesopotamian society, and keeping it flowing was as critical as keeping your Wi-Fi connection stable during a Netflix binge. The planners of these festivals had to ensure that grain moved from the fields to the feasting tables without a hitch. This wasn't just about logistics, it was about survival. A hiccup in the supply chain could mean empty tables, grumbling stomachs, and a very unhappy populace. And let's face it, no one wanted a hungry mob on their hands while trying to keep the gods entertained. The trade networks that made these festivals possible were impressive. Picture merchants travelling hundreds of miles along the ancient trade routes, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia, all to bring back the finest goods. It was like the Silk Road, but with more sand and fewer Marco Polos. These traders weren't just moving goods, they were connecting cultures, spreading ideas, and making sure that when the festival came, the tables were laden with the best the ancient world had to offer. Think imported dates, exotic spices, and enough wool to clothe an army of sheep. And while the Sumerian elite were busy counting their profits and the priests were tallying up their offerings, the workers behind the scenes were the unsung heroes of these massive undertakings. They toiled away ensuring that every detail was perfect, from the placement of a sacrificial lamb to the timing of a ritual dance. For them, the festival was less about divine favour and more about job security. These events kept the economy humming and people employed, which was crucial in a time when a bad harvest or a poor trade season could spell disaster. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the economic benefits without acknowledging the stark realities. While festivals did stimulate the economy, they also highlighted the vast inequalities of the time. The ruling class might have been revelling in their divine connections, but for many the festival was a reminder of their place in the social hierarchy. The workers who made it all possible often had little time to enjoy the fruits of their labour. Instead, they were busy ensuring that the upper echelons could party like the gods themselves. In this ancient world, the festivals played a dual role. They were grand celebrations of culture and piety, but they were also practical necessities, a way to keep the economy ticking over and the people employed. They were a reminder that even in the most divine of celebrations, the mundane realities of supply and demand ruled supreme. So, the next time you find yourself grumbling about the cost of a holiday celebration or the madness of a Black Friday sale, remember the Sumerians who mastered the art of turning a party into an economic powerhouse. And speaking of economic powerhouses, let's not forget the city-states themselves. Hosting a successful festival was a matter of prestige and a show of strength. It was the ancient equivalent of hosting the Olympics, complete with international visitors, trade opportunities, and a parade of local pride. These events solidified a city's status as a cultural and economic hub, attracting merchants, artisans, and even the occasional curious traveller from far-flung lands. It was a chance to flex a little civic muscle and remind the neighbours who was really running the show in the Fertile Crescent. As we peel back the layers of these festivals, it's clear that they were far more than just religious gatherings. They were complex socio-economic systems that wove together the threads of devotion, commerce and politics into a tapestry as intricate as any Sumerian weave. They were a reminder that even in the most pious of times, the wheels of commerce and the gears of society must keep turning, just as smooth as a well-oiled Babylonian beard. So, while we've debunked a few myths and laid bare some harsh realities, There's more to explore in this ancient world where the divine met the everyday and where every festival was a balancing act between survival and celebration. Stay tuned, because the story of these incredible gatherings is far from over. There's still plenty of ancient revelry to uncover, and who knows, maybe a few more surprises await in the clay tablets of history. And so, the curtain draws on our ancient Mesopotamian festival tour, a kaleidoscope of devotion, economics, and the world's earliest recorded hangovers. But before we turn off the lights on the ziggurat, let's connect the dots between these grand celebrations and the cultural DNA of Mesopotamia. It's time to shake off the dust of myth and look at how these festivals weren't just about appeasing the gods or flexing civic muscle. They were about crafting the very identity of a civilization. First, let's boot the myth of the Mesopotamian Golden Age right out the door. Sure, it's tempting to romanticize the past as a time of unbroken harmony and eternal feasts, but here's the hard truth. Life was tough. The Tigris and Euphrates may have provided fertile ground, but they also flooded unpredictably, and city-states were as likely to trade insults as they were grain. Yet, amidst this chaos, festivals were a stabilizing force. They created a shared narrative, a sense of belonging that transcended the daily grind of survival. They were the social glue that held together a society constantly dancing on the edge of chaos and order. These festivals etched a lasting impact on religious practices. The Akatu festival, for example, wasn't just about rebooting the cosmos. It was a strategic tool for kings to reinforce their divine mandate. By participating in these rituals, rulers claimed a celestial endorsement that was hard to argue with, unless you fancied the idea of a divine smackdown. This blend of religion and politics would echo through time, influencing later cultures that fused divine right with political authority. Talk about a legacy that sticks like a barley loaf to the bottom of a pot. Economically, festivals were like the ancient world's version of Black Friday, with less consumerism but just as much chaos. They required massive resources but also stimulated the economy, creating a ripple effect that boosted trade and labor. They were a reminder that even in ancient times, nothing greased the wheels of society like a good celebration. And while it's easy to chuckle at the notion of the city running on bread and beer, it's worth noting that these staples were the backbone of Mesopotamian sustenance. Without them, there would be no revelry, no rituals, and certainly no reason for merchants to haul their goods across desert sands. Socially, these festivals were a great equalizer, at least in theory. They promised a momentary suspension of social norms, a temporary oasis where everyone from kings to commoners could engage in the same celebrations. But let's not kid ourselves, the reality was more stratified. While the elite enjoyed the best seats at the divine drama, the workers toiled to keep the show running. Still, within this hierarchy, festivals offered a space where shared experiences could bridge divides, where the stories of gods and men intertwined in a narrative that every Mesopotamian knew by heart. Now, what does all this mean for us, sitting here with our smartphones and streaming services, pondering life's great mysteries like, why does my Wi-Fi keep dropping? Modern society could take a page from the Mesopotamian playbook on blending reverence with revelry. These festivals remind us of the power of collective experience, the importance of shared stories, and the need for community, even if our gods have traded in their lightning bolts for likes on social media. And while we've thankfully left behind the more unsavory practices, looking at you, human sacrifices, we can still appreciate the art of celebration as a means of fostering unity and resilience. In a world where division often seems like the default setting, the Mesopotamians showed us that coming together in shared purpose, even if it's just for a party, can be a powerful force. So, next time you're at a gathering, whether it's a family reunion or a virtual meetup, remember the Sumerians who partied like their cosmos depended on it because, in a way, it did. In conclusion, these festivals were more than mere historical footnotes. They were the heartbeat of Mesopotamian society. They shaped an identity that has echoed through millennia, influencing cultures far beyond the Fertile Crescent. As we wrap up this journey through time, let's not just leave these stories in the past. Let's carry forward the lessons of community, resilience, and the simple joy of gathering, even if the only thing we're sacrificing is some free time to binge-watch the latest series. After all, in the grand tapestry of human history, sometimes the most profound truths are uncovered not in the solemn halls of academia, but in the laughter and camaraderie of a festival well celebrated. In the hustle and bustle of ancient Greece, where democracy was just learning to crawl, and philosophers were busy asking the big questions like, what's the meaning of life? And do olives go better, with or without feta? There was another art form quietly taking shape. It wasn't all toga parties and Socratic debates, folks. We're talking pottery. Ancient Greece's version of TikTok, but far less annoying and distinctly more durable. It was a time when the kind of pot you had in your house said a lot about you. Yes, those pots were the OG status symbols, proving that humanity's obsession with brand-name goods is anything but new. Let's break it down. Pottery in ancient Greece wasn't just about slapping some clay on a wheel and hoping for the best. No, this was an art form. It was a cultural cornerstone that told stories as much as it stored wine. There were two main styles that really put Greece on the ceramics map: red figure and black figure techniques. These weren't just fancy names. They were revolutionary artistic methods that turned simple clay into storytelling canvases. The black figure technique was like the iPhone of the pottery world around the 6th century BCE. Artisans would paint silhouetted figures in a black glaze on the natural red clay, then fire it up in a kiln hotter than a Greek summer. The details were etched with a sharp tool, allowing the red beneath to pop out like a plot twist in a Greek tragedy. But then came the red figure technique around 530 BCE, flipping the script by painting the background black and letting the figures glow in the natural red of the clay. This allowed for more intricate details. Think of it as upgrading from 2D to HD. But hold on, before you start thinking ancient Greeks were just bored and artsy, let's talk economics. Pottery was big business. Whether you were storing olives, wine, grain, or whatever else the ancient Greek diet deemed necessary, you needed pots. The amphora, a tall jar with two handles, was the go-to for liquid storage, while the kylix, a shallow drinking cup, was perfect for your next symposium. A very adult version of a college mixer, complete with philosophical debates and plenty of wine. The pottery trade was crucial to the Greek economy. Those pots weren't just for local use, they were export-ready, shipped across the Mediterranean to places like Egypt and Italy. This wasn't just about function, it was about form, about having a piece of Greek culture in your home, like owning a piece of art. Imagine trying to flex on your neighbors with a fancy amphora in your living room. It's like owning the latest smartphone, but with a lot more history and a lot less planned obsolescence. Socially, pottery was a method of storytelling. The Greeks didn't have Netflix, so they had to get creative with their narratives, painting scenes from mythology, daily life, and even epic battles onto their ceramics. It was like a graphic novel in clay, with each piece telling a story that was both personal and universal, and let's not forget the artists themselves, many of whom signed their work. Talk about early influencer culture. These artists were the stars, their signatures adding value much like a brand name today. Yet while we romantically envision these artisans as singular geniuses, the reality was likely more of a team effort. Workshops were bustling with workers who might not have shared the spotlight, but were essential to the process. Behind every famous potter, there was probably an unsung hero mixing clay or managing the kiln's temperature like a maestro. So while it's easy to picture a solitary artist toiling away, creating masterpieces in the glow of a Grecian sunset, the truth is, pottery was as much about teamwork as it was about individual skill. Plus, you can bet there was some serious competition. The market was flooded, and standing out meant pushing the boundaries of what those pots could convey. In the grand scheme of things, these pots were more than just vessels. They were cultural ambassadors, storytellers, and symbols of Greek ingenuity and style. They held not just oil and wine, but the spirit of a civilization that, much like our own, was constantly seeking ways to express itself and leave a mark on the world. And let's be honest, the Greeks couldn't have known that millennia later, people would still be drooling over their pottery in museums around the world. If that's not the ultimate bragging right, what is? So, the Greeks had their pottery game on lock. But what exactly went into making these masterpieces? Let's dive into the nitty-gritty, or should I say, the muddy reality of ancient Greek pottery making. Spoiler alert, it wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Forget any romantic visions of toga-clad artists serenely crafting pots in sun-dappled studios. The truth was far more back-breaking and, let's face it, dirty. First things first, you needed clay, the lifeblood of the pottery process. But it wasn't just any dirt you could scoop up from your backyard. The best clay came from specific regions such as Attica, known for its rich iron-infused deposits that gave the pots their iconic red hue. This wasn't a buy one get one free deal at the local market. Potters had to either dig it up themselves or shell out precious drachmas to get their hands on the good stuff. Imagine lugging heavy loads of clay back to your workshop in the scorching sun. It's enough to make a modern-day gym session look like a leisurely stroll. Once the clay was in hand, the real work began. The clay had to be meticulously prepared, much like a Michelin-starred chef prepping ingredients for a 5-course meal. It was soaked, kneaded, and filtered to remove pesky impurities. Think of it as giving the clay a deep tissue massage. Only then was it ready to be shaped on the potter's wheel, a task that required both skill and a fair bit of upper body strength. Picture a potter hunched over, muscles straining, as they coaxed the clay into shape with a finesse that belied the laborious effort behind each graceful curve. The potter's wheel itself was a marvel of ancient engineering, a simple yet effective tool that revolutionized pottery production. It allowed for more symmetrical and intricate designs, but it also demanded a level of dexterity and precision that was anything but beginner-friendly. One slip, and your masterpiece could turn into a lopsided disaster faster than you could say Zeus's beard. It's no wonder that mastering the wheel was a rite of passage for any aspiring potter. But let's not get too carried away by the romance of spinning clay. These artisans didn't exactly live the high life. Pottery workshops were often cramped, dimly lit spaces where the sweat and toil of daily labour were palpable. Forget luxury villas. These potters were more likely to be found in modest homes, their lives a far cry from the opulent lifestyles of the elite who bought their wares. The reality was a constant grind, a daily hustle to meet demand and make ends meet. Hardly the stuff of epic poetry, but certainly a testament to human perseverance. Economically speaking, pottery was both a craft and a business. The cost of materials, labour, and the all-important kiln firings added up. A single firing could make or break a workshop's finances, with potters praying to whichever god was in vogue that their creations would survive the process intact. And let's not forget the trade dynamics at play. Pottery wasn't just a local affair. Greek pots found their way to markets across the Mediterranean, from the bustling bazaars of Egypt to the sophisticated salons of Etruria. It was a complex web of supply and demand, with potters constantly balancing the books to stay afloat. Despite the challenges, these potters were nothing if not resourceful. They formed guilds, shared techniques, and even developed marketing strategies to distinguish their products in a crowded market. Some workshops became renowned for their distinctive styles, their names whispered among those in the know, like the latest fashion house. And while the potters themselves might not have enjoyed the fruits of their labour, their legacy is undeniable. From humble workshops came creations that continue to captivate us today, each piece a silent witness to the labour, skill, and ingenuity of its maker. So next time you're admiring a piece of ancient Greek pottery, remember the unsung heroes behind the art, the artisans who turned a lump of clay into a vessel of stories, who worked tirelessly in the shadows to create beauty that would endure for millennia. They may not have lived like kings, but their work has certainly earned them a place in the annals of history, and that's a legacy worth spinning. But let's shift gears a bit and dive into the tales these pottery pieces told, because every amphora, kylix, and crater was a storyteller in its own right, spinning yarns that were as rich and varied as the culture that produced them. Now, we all love a good story. The Greeks were no different, except their storytellers wielded brushes instead of pens and clay instead of parchment. Imagine the ancient Greek equivalent of a graphic novel, but with fewer capes and more togas. Mythology was the bread and butter of Greek ceramic art, and these pots were practically shouting their narratives from the rooftops, or rather, the shelves of every symposium and marketplace. They depicted epic tales that were part of the Greek cultural DNA, heroic exploits of Hercules, the dramatic saga of Troy, or the timeless misadventures of Odysseus. It was like binge-watching the ancient world's greatest hits, but with the added risk of breaking if you handled them too roughly. But hold up. Before we start waxing lyrical about the rich stories these pots told, let's not forget that their narratives weren't all unicorns and rainbows, or, in this case, chariots and laurels. Some of these pieces depicted everyday scenes that were as gritty as a Greek market after hours. Picture the bustling life of an ancient Athenian agora, the camaraderie of a gymnasium, or the earthy allure of a country festival. They were snapshots of life, as vivid as a travel blog, but way less filtered. Now, here's where the plot thickens. The romantic notion of pottery as purely an artistic endeavour is about as accurate as calling Twitter a place for polite discourse. Sure, they were pretty and told enchanting tales, but they were also deeply intertwined with the practicalities of commerce and politics. Take, for instance, the fact that many of these pieces were essentially the ancient world's equivalent of branded merchandise. They weren't just functional or decorative, they were a statement. Political alliances and rivalries often played out in the realm of pottery, with designs reflecting the shifting sands of power and influence. Some pieces were commissioned to celebrate political achievements or curry favour with the right people. Imagine gifting a beautifully crafted amphora to win over a political ally, or as a tribute to a victorious general. In this way, pottery was as much about networking as it was about narrative. And here's a juicy tidbit for you. The artists who crafted these pieces weren't merely artisans, they were the influencers of their day. The more renowned the potter, the better the price their work commanded, and the more likely it was to end up gracing the table of someone influential. That's right, even back then, people were willing to pay a premium for a signature piece, as if owning a pot signed by Exarchias was the ancient equivalent of having a verified blue tick on your profile. But there's more to this story than just personal glory. The pottery trade was a significant economic force, and the demand for these intricately decorated vessels extended far beyond the borders of Greece. Whether it was Etruscans in Italy or Egyptians along the Nile, everyone wanted a piece of that Greek artistic mojo. Pottery workshops had to navigate a complex web of trade routes and market dynamics, ensuring their wares reached the right buyers at the right time, a balancing act that would make even a modern economist break into a sweat. Now, let's address the elephant, or perhaps the minotaur, in the room. The modern glorification of Greek pottery often overlooks the fact that art has always been politicized, and these ceramics were no different. They served as both propaganda and public relations tools. Want to promote the victory of Athens over Persia? Slap it onto a crater. Need to immortalize the latest political alliance? Paint it on an amphora. These pots were the ancient media, broadcasting news and shaping public opinion one brushstroke at a time. So, while it's easy to get swept up in the romantic allure of these ancient artifacts, it's essential to recognize the duality of their existence. They were both art and advertisement, storytelling and status symbol, reflecting a society that was as complex as the narratives they depicted. The beauty of Greek pottery lies not just in its aesthetic appeal, but in the stories it tells about a civilization that was as adept at weaving tales as it was at wielding power. And let's not forget the unsung heroes of this story, the potters and painters who poured their hearts and souls into their craft. They may not have been philosophers or generals, but through their work they left a legacy that continues to captivate us millennia later. Their pots were more than just clay and glaze. They were vessels of human experience, capturing the essence of a vibrant and dynamic society, one that was as flawed and fascinating as any that has followed. As we continue our journey through the world of ancient Greek pottery, let's remember to look beyond the surface, to delve into the layers of history and humanity that these artifacts represent. There's much more to uncover, and who knows what other stories these pots still have to tell. Stay tuned, because we're just getting started. But the story of Greek pottery doesn't just end with tales spun on clay. Oh no, these vessels were the rock stars of their age, going on tour across the Mediterranean and beyond, leaving shards of influence everywhere they went. While Odysseus was busy getting lost at sea, Greek pots were finding their way into every corner of the ancient world, from the bustling ports of the Levant to the distant shores of Spain. And this wasn't just a casual stroll, it was more like a carefully orchestrated world tour, with all the logistics of a modern-day rock band, minus the groupies. Let's talk trade routes. These weren't just humble paths trodden by merchants with donkeys. This was the ancient version of the Silk Road, a complex network of maritime and overland routes that transformed the Mediterranean into a bustling hub of commerce and culture. Greek pottery was shipped out in massive quantities, becoming a staple of international trade. From the 6th century BCE onwards, these pots were as ubiquitous as smartphones in a hipster cafe. They made their way to Etruria in Italy, where they inspired local artisans to create their own versions. Think of it as an ancient version of cultural appropriation, but with fewer lawsuits. The Greeks were like the apple of the ancient world, with their pottery seen as the premium product. The Made in Greece label was a mark of quality that had buyers reaching for their drachmas faster than you can say Homer's Iliad. They were the Louis Vuitton bags of their time, except instead of flaunting a monogram, they boasted scenes of myth and heroism. The branding was subtle yet effective. An amphora from Athens was instantly recognizable, not just for its style, but for its craftsmanship. These artisans knew the power of a strong brand, long before modern marketers started slapping logos on everything from socks to soda cans. And we can't ignore the economic impact this trade had. Greek pottery wasn't just art, it was a vital economic driver. The export of these ceramics helped fuel the economy, bringing in wealth that allowed city-states like Athens to flourish. This wasn't just about selling pots, it was about establishing Greece as a cultural powerhouse. If you wanted to be seen as sophisticated in the ancient world, you had a Greek pot in your house. It was a status symbol, a way to show that you were in the know, that you appreciated the finer things in life, even if that just meant having a stylish pot to hold your olive oil. But here's where things get really interesting. While Greek pottery was spreading its influence far and wide, it was also undergoing a transformation of its own. As these pots reached new markets, they began to absorb elements from the cultures they encountered. It was a two-way street. Greek artists borrowed motifs and styles from Egyptian, Persian, and Etruscan art, creating a dynamic fusion that enriched their own artistic traditions. So, while these pots were busy colonizing the world, they were also being colonized in return, a testament to the fluidity and adaptability of Greek culture. However, the romantic image of Greek pots as cultural ambassadors belies the reality of the trade. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Piracy was a constant threat, with marauding sea bands eager to plunder a shipment of valuable goods. Merchants had to navigate treacherous waters, both literal and political, to ensure their cargo reached its destination. The seas were as unpredictable as a Greek god's mood, and a storm could spell disaster for even the best-laid plans. This was a high-risk venture, one that required a keen understanding of both maritime and market dynamics. And let's not forget the social impact. The spread of Greek pottery wasn't just about economics, it was about cultural exchange. Every pot that landed in a foreign port was a piece of Greek culture, a tangible link to the stories and values of its creators. In a world without global media, these pots were a way to share ideas and aesthetics across vast distances, fostering a sense of connection and understanding between disparate peoples. It was globalization, ancient style, complete with all the complexity and nuance that comes with it. Yet, while it's tempting to see this trade as a smooth operation, the reality was a little grittier. Potters and merchants weren't exactly rolling in drachmas. The market was competitive, with workshops constantly vying for the attention of buyers. It was a game of innovation and strategy, where the next big trend could make or break a workshop's fortunes. And while some artisans achieved fame and fortune, many more toiled in obscurity, their contributions lost to history. It was a classic case of survival of the fittest, with only the most skilled and savvy managing to thrive. In the end, the story of Greek pottery is a testament to the power of art and commerce to transcend borders and time. These pots were more than just containers. They were conduits of culture, carriers of stories that continue to resonate with us today. They remind us that even in the ancient world, people were driven by the same desires and ambitions that propel us now: the quest for beauty, the pursuit of knowledge, and the need to connect with others. So while the Greeks may not have had social media to spread their influence, they had something even more enduring, the timeless appeal of a well-crafted pot. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. As we wrap up this epic journey through the world of ancient Greek pottery, let's pull the lens back a bit and gaze at the big picture. Ancient Greek pottery wasn't just the ceramic equivalent of a viral TikTok trend. It was a cornerstone of cultural exchange, economic prowess, and artistic expression. But what makes these ancient vessels more than just museum relics gathering dust in glass cases? Well, for one, they continue to cast a long shadow over modern art and design, proving that some trends never truly fade, they simply evolve. Today, you can't walk into a home decor store without tripping over something inspired by ancient Greek aesthetics. Those sleek lines, geometric patterns, and mythological motifs have been repurposed into everything from minimalist vases to avant-garde fashion. The timeless appeal of Greek pottery lies in its balance of form and function, something that today's designers still aim for, but with a contemporary twist. It's as if these age-old ceramics whispered their secrets to modern creatives, saying, "You too can blend beauty with utility." That's why you'll find echoes of Greek artistry in the latest fashion collections, and even in the architecture of modern buildings, where columns and pediments nod to their ancient predecessors. But let's not get too misty-eyed about the legacy without acknowledging the practical side. Greek pottery has been a goldmine for archaeologists, providing a treasure trove of information about ancient societies. While written records from antiquity are as rare as a Grecian urn without a chip, potsherds, those broken bits of pottery, are everywhere. They tell us what people ate, drank, and even how they traded. It's like having a time machine that runs on clay fragments instead of flux capacitors. These shards help us piece together the daily lives of people who lived thousands of years ago, offering insights that dusty old scrolls simply can't match. And here's the kicker. While it's easy to romanticize these ancient artisans as visionary creatives, the reality was often as gritty as the clay they molded. The potter's life was a far cry from glamorous. They were the blue-collar workers of their day, slogging through long hours in cramped workshops. Yet, despite their humble circumstances, they managed to leave an indelible mark on history. Their pots have outlasted empires, standing as a testament to the enduring power of craftsmanship. Consider the economic muscle behind this artistry. In ancient Greece, pottery wasn't just art for art's sake. It was big business. The production of ceramics was an intricate dance of supply and demand, with workshops constantly innovating to stay ahead of the curve. These artisans weren't just creators. They were entrepreneurs, navigating a market as volatile as a sea voyage in the Aegean. They understood the importance of branding long before it became a corporate buzzword, and their creations were the luxury goods of their time. Yet for all the talk of commerce and culture, let's not overlook the politics woven into the clay. Greek pottery served as both propaganda and storytelling medium, capturing the zeitgeist of an era in each brushstroke. Whether celebrating a military victory or subtly critiquing a political regime, these vessels were the social media of their day, broadcasting messages to anyone who cared to look. It's a reminder that art has always been a powerful tool for shaping public opinion, and Greek potters wielded it with a deftness that would make any spin doctor proud. As we close the chapter on our exploration of ancient Greek pottery, let's spare a thought for those unsung heroes, the potters themselves. These artisans might not have had statues erected in their honor, but their legacy endures in every fragment of clay that survives. They turned humble materials into objects of beauty and utility, telling stories that transcended time and space. Their work reminds us that art is not just about aesthetics. It's about the human experience, about striving to create something that will outlast our fleeting existence. In the end, the story of Greek pottery is a tale of innovation, resilience, and adaptation, a narrative that's as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. So the next time you sip wine from a stylishly designed glass or admire a modern sculpture, take a moment to thank the ancient Greeks. Their legacy lives on, not just in the museums of the world, but in the everyday objects that continue to enrich our lives. These pots may have started as clay on a wheel, but they've become vessels of culture, carrying the spirit of a civilization that, much like our own, sought to leave its mark on the world. And if that's not the ultimate testament to the power of art, what is? You're jolted awake not by the gentle chime of an alarm clock, but by the raucous cawing of crows overhead, as if they're auditioning for their own heavy metal band. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, a scent so familiar it's practically your morning coffee. Welcome to your life as an 8th century Viking blacksmith, where the day is as much forged by fire as the iron you shape. Now, before you start picturing yourself as Thor's personal armourer, let's set the record straight. While the Vikings have a reputation for raiding and pillaging, thank you, Hollywood, your role is far more crucial to the community than just hammering out swords for the next raid. You, my friend, are the backbone of Viking society. You create the tools and weapons that let everyone else do their jobs, from fighting to farming. Without you, the whole operation falls apart faster than an IKEA shelf without its Allen wrench. Your day begins in the workshop, a bustling hub of activity and noise. Forget the sleek, minimalist blacksmith setups you might see in movies. This is the real deal: dirt floors, a thatched roof, and a haze of soot that gives you a perpetual goth aesthetic without any of the modern subculture's perks. Your tools? An anvil, tongs, a hammer, and a forge blazing hot enough to turn iron ore into something useful. Yeah, it's not glamorous, but it's vital. Speaking of iron, let's talk smelting. It's easy to think of the Dark Ages as a time of technological stagnation, but the process of turning raw ore into workable metal was anything but primitive. You're working with a bloomery, a furnace that can reach temperatures of about 1,300 degrees Celsius. You're basically a medieval chemist, combining iron ore with charcoal and blasting it with bellows to get rid of impurities. This isn't just about brute force, it's about finesse. You're in the business of alchemy, turning raw earth into something that can change the world. Here's the kicker: iron isn't just for making weapons. Sure, swords and axes get all the glory, but most of your work goes into crafting tools for farming and building. Plowshares, hoes, nails. These aren't the stuff of legends, but they are the stuff of life. A good iron plowshare can make the difference between a bumper crop and a famine. So while everyone talks about the Vikings as warriors, it's the blacksmiths who quietly keep everything running smoothly. It's like being the unsung hero of a reality show, except with more soot and fewer camera crews. And let's not forget the economy. Iron tools and weapons are valuable trade items, and your skills make you a key player in the local economy. Forget the romantic notion of Viking raids bringing in all the goods. Trade networks crisscross the Viking world, stretching from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire. Your handiwork might end up in a market hundreds of miles away, exchanged for silver, spices, or exotic goods. You're not just crafting metal, you're crafting connections. But before you get too comfortable, remember that being a blacksmith isn't just about the work, it's also about the community. Your workshop isn't isolated, it's a social hub. Folks come by to commission new tools, repair old ones, or just share the latest gossip. You're not just a craftsman, you're a confidant, a problem solver, and sometimes even the village therapist, all without a degree in psychology, mind you. Now, why does all this matter? Because it paints a picture of a society where everyone had a role to play, and yours was one of the most essential. Without blacksmiths, the Vikings wouldn't have been able to farm effectively, build robust settlements, or defend themselves. Your contribution goes far beyond the battlefield or the barn. It's woven into the very fabric of daily life. So as you stand there, hammer in hand, with the firelight flickering against the walls, take a moment to appreciate the weight of history on your shoulders. You're not just shaping metal, you're shaping the future. And while you might not get a statue erected in your honor, your legacy is etched in every tool and weapon you craft. In a world often defined by its warriors, you are the maker of legends, the unsung hero of the Viking Age. As you stand there, hammer in hand, basking in the warm glow of your forge, you can't help but marvel at the sheer artistry of your craft. But let's not get carried away with poetic musings. There's a sword to be made, and this isn't some Hollywood montage where you swing a hammer a few times, wipe your brow, and voila! You're about to embark on a process that's more marathon than sprint, involving materials you wouldn't expect and techniques that would make even the most ardent DIY enthusiast reconsider their life choices. Let's start with the star of the show, bog iron. Sounds glamorous, right? Picture yourself wading through murky wetlands, digging up chunks of iron-rich earth that resemble nothing so much as rusty sponge cake. This is the raw material for your masterpiece. Bog iron is essentially a renewable resource, unlike those finite veins of ore found elsewhere. It's formed by iron bacteria oxidizing iron in the water, leaving deposits in the bog. You're not just a blacksmith, you're an environmentalist avant la lettre, sustainably sourcing your materials long before it was cool. Now, onto the actual forging. You've got your bloomery furnace roaring at a toasty 1200 degrees Celsius again, ready to transform that bog iron into something worthy of a Viking warrior. But first, you've got to get rid of all those impurities. This is no casual Saturday afternoon project, it's more akin to a metal detox, where you're left with solid lumps of iron known as blooms. You'll hammer these relentlessly, folding them over and over in a process that feels like trying to fold a fitted sheet, frustratingly complex and never quite square. Now, let's talk about the Ulfbert swords. These blades are the Rockstars of Viking weaponry. with a reputation as fearsome as their owners. They were the Ferraris of the Viking Age, made with such high carbon content that they were virtually unparalleled in Europe at the time. But here's the myth-busting kicker. Not every Viking was strutting around with one of these bad boys at their hip. In fact, swords were a status symbol, often owned by the elite, and an Ulfberht sword was like carrying a small fortune on your belt. Imagine the price of a modern sports car, and you're in the ballpark. For most Vikings, an Ulfberht was as out of reach as a private jet is for us mortals today. The process of making these swords was no easy feat either. The secret lay in the steel crucible steel, to be precise, which was imported from as far afield as the Middle East. This isn't just a case of mixing a few ingredients and hoping for the best. It's precise chemistry, requiring the right combination of iron and carbon to produce a metal that's strong yet flexible. You're part blacksmith, part alchemist, and all genius. But why go to all this trouble? Because swords were more than just weapons. They were symbols of power, prestige, and technological prowess. In a world where personal combat was a way of life, having a superior blade could mean the difference between victory and a very one-sided conversation with the afterlife. And let's not forget the economic aspect. A sword was an investment, the kind of asset that could be traded, inherited, or even used as collateral. Forget about crypto. This was the currency of the day, tangible and deadly. And while we're on the subject of trade, let's dispel another myth. Vikings weren't just raiders with wanderlust and an axe. They were shrewd traders, with networks stretching from the frigid waters of Scandinavia to the opulent courts of Byzantium. Your handiwork might end up as far away as Baghdad, exchanged for silk, spices, or silver. Imagine a Viking trader bartering your finely crafted sword for a bolt of Chinese silk or a bag of exotic spices. It's a small world, even by Viking standards. But these swords weren't just changing hands. They were changing lives, influencing cultures, and shaping history. Each blade carried with it the sweat and skill of its maker, the aspirations of its owner, and the complex web of trade routes that brought raw materials from distant lands to your forge. You're not just creating a weapon, you're crafting a narrative, a story that will be told long after the last blow is struck. So, as you stand there, watching the sparks fly and the metal transform under your skilled hands, remember this: you're not just a blacksmith. You're a storyteller, a trader, a craftsman of the highest order, and an integral part of a vast, interconnected world. In a society often defined by its warriors, you are the unsung architect of their legends, the creator of the tools that built an empire, and the weaver of tales that resonate through the ages. Yet, as you wipe the sweat from your brow and watch the forge flicker like a medieval disco ball, let's hit pause on our metal symphony and take a good look around the forge. Here's where the real drama unfolds, the social and political tapestry woven right here in this smoky little corner of the world. Blacksmiths in the Viking era were more than just the neighborhood fix-it folks. They were basically the Elon Musks of their day, blending innovation with influence, minus the Twitter debacles. Now, you might think of a blacksmith as just a hammer-swinging artisan, but back then they wielded more social clout than a bard with a juicy scandal. Consider this. In a society where everything from the sword to the plough depended on your craftsmanship, your status was as solid as the iron you worked with. You were indispensable, a true linchpin in the Viking community. Forget about being just another cog in the wheel. You were the one who made sure the wheel didn't fall off at the first bump. And let's not overlook your relationship with the local chieftains. These guys weren't just your average bosses. They were more like the mobsters of the Viking world, and you were their consigliere. Sure, they led raids and ruled lands, but without your weapons and tools, they'd be as effective as a warrior armed with a wet noodle. In fact, your forge was the medieval equivalent of the Pentagon contractor, churning out the cutting-edge tech, literally, that kept their power intact. Your tools were more than just instruments. They were statements of power. A chieftain with a blacksmith in his corner was like a modern politician with a media empire at their disposal. It was a symbiotic relationship, a balance of power, if you will. You needed the chieftains for protection and resources, and they needed you for, well, everything else. It was a delicate dance, part Game of Thrones, part DIY network. Now, let's dissect the idea of the forge as a hub of innovation. Sure, it might look like a soot-covered shack, but imagine it as a startup incubator with you as the Steve Jobs of metallurgy. This wasn't just a place of labour. It was where ideas were born, debated, and sometimes even discarded like last week's sourdough starter. Here, you weren't just refining metal, you were refining ideas, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the materials at hand. Innovation didn't just mean better swords or sharper axes. It meant creating tools that could change the game in farming, building, and even navigation. Remember, the Vikings weren't just marauders, they were explorers, traders, and settlers. Your innovations in metallurgy helped facilitate all of that. The seafaring adventures that took Vikings to the edges of the known world were made possible because you were back home tinkering with nails that wouldn't rust and ship fittings that could withstand the North Sea's fury. Think of your forge as the epicenter of a web of trade and communication. The tools and weapons crafted here didn't just stay local. They travelled far and wide, carried by the hands of traders, warriors, and settlers. Each item was a piece of technology, a fragment of knowledge shared across cultures, like an ancient version of open-source software. And you, my friend, were at the heart of it all, a pioneer in a world that didn't even know it needed one. So, as you stand amid the heat and noise, remember that you're not just a craftsman. You're a pivotal player in a grander narrative, shaping societies with every swing of your hammer. The social and political threads that connect you to the wider world are as complex as the patterns in a Damascus blade. In a time when the written word was scarce, your work spoke volumes, carving a legacy that would echo through the ages. It's a lot to take in, but hey, no pressure. After all, you're just changing the world, one piece of iron at a time. Now, as the forge's glow fades behind you, it's time to step into the broader Viking stage, where blacksmithing is more than a trade. It's a thread woven into the cultural and religious tapestry of the Norse world. You see, the blacksmith's role wasn't confined to crafting swords and plowshares. It extended into the realm of myth and ritual, where every hammer strike resonated with divine echoes. Let's talk symbolism. The Vikings weren't just marauders with a penchant for pillaging. They were deeply spiritual, and their mythology was as rich and complex as a Wagner opera, minus the Valkyries and horned helmets, because, spoiler alert, they never wore those. Take Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, a weapon so legendary it makes Excalibur look like a butter knife. Blacksmiths crafted Mjolnir pendants, not just as fashion statements, but as powerful amulets believed to protect the wearer from harm. These pendants, often found in burial sites, were crafted with skill and care, a testament to the deep respect for the gods and the smith's role as the artisans of divine armor. And while we're on the subject of hammers, it's worth noting the myth-busting reality. Mjolnir wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a symbol of fertility and blessing, used in rituals to consecrate marriages and births. Here's the kicker. The blacksmiths who made these pendants weren't just working metal, they were crafting connections to the divine. In a society where the gods were as real as the next raid, owning a piece of sacred craftsmanship was akin to having a direct line to Asgard. But let's not get too swept up in the romance without addressing the reality. These pendants, while imbued with symbolic power, didn't come with a guarantee from Thor himself. The idea that donning a Mjolnir amulet would grant you invincibility is as fanciful as believing that wearing a Superman cape will let you leap tall buildings in a single bound. The practical reality was that these items were more about social identity and communal belief than actual magical protection. In a world fraught with uncertainty, a bit of symbolic reassurance was as comforting as a warm woolen cloak on a frigid Scandinavian night. Now, turning our gaze to the artistry of jewelry, the blacksmith's work extended further than pendants. They crafted intricate brooches, arm rings, and necklaces, each piece a testament to both technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. These items weren't merely decorative, they were statements of social status and wealth. Wearing a finely wrought piece of jewelry was like driving a luxury car today. It told the world you had arrived. And let's face it, in the competitive social landscape of the Viking Age, a little bling went a long way in establishing one's place in the pecking order. But here's where we peel back another layer of myth. While Viking jewelry is often associated with opulence, the truth is more nuanced. The materials, bronze, silver, and occasionally gold, had to be carefully sourced and were often recycled from other items. Vikings were nothing if not resourceful. Coins from far-flung lands were melted down and transformed into new creations, each piece a blend of local craftsmanship and international flair. This wasn't just recycling, it was a testament to the interconnectedness of the Viking world, where every piece of jewelry carried the whispers of distant lands. And speaking of whispers, let's delve into the supposed magical properties of Viking swords. The legend of the Ulfberht sword, for instance, tells of blades with almost mythical strength, supposedly imbued with magic. In reality, the secret was high-carbon crucible steel, a technological marvel that enhanced the sword's resilience. But magic? Not so much. These swords were the result of meticulous craftsmanship and advanced metallurgy, not the incantations of sorcerers. It's easy to see how stories of enchanted blades would capture the imagination. But the truth is, the real magic lay in the hands of the skilled smiths who knew their craft inside out. Yet, there's no denying the allure of these tales. In a time when life was precarious and the gods were capricious, the idea of wielding a sword blessed with supernatural powers was as appealing as a winning lottery ticket. But here's the rub. For every legendary sword, there were countless more that were perfectly ordinary, forged for practicality and durability, not destiny. The myth of the magic sword is a classic case of selective storytelling, where the extraordinary overshadows the everyday reality. And let's not forget the role of blacksmiths in ritual and ceremony. They were often seen as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, their forges akin to sacred spaces where metal was transformed under their skilled hands. This wasn't just about making weapons, it was about forging the very fabric of society. In a world where the line between the spiritual and material was blurred, the blacksmith's work was as much about faith as it was about function. So, as you stand at the crossroads of myth and reality, remember this: the blacksmiths of the Viking Age were artists, innovators, and spiritual guides. They bridged the gap between the mundane and the divine, crafting not just metal, but meaning. And while the legends of magic swords and divine hammers may capture the imagination, the true story is one of human ingenuity and cultural significance. In the end, the blacksmiths weren't just forging metal, they were shaping the very identity of the Viking world. Their creations were the threads that wove together mythology, ritual, and social structure, each piece a testament to the complex interplay of belief and practicality. And as you ponder the legacy of these unsung artisans, it's clear that their impact was as enduring as the iron they shaped, a testament to the enduring power of craft and creativity in a world that balanced on the edge of myth and reality. Yet here we are, at the end of our day in the life of a Viking blacksmith, standing at the crossroads of myth and reality, and it's time to reflect on the legacy left by these unsung heroes of the Norse world. The blacksmiths of the Viking Age weren't just metal workers, they were the beating heart of their communities, shaping not only iron but the very fabric of society. Their legacy is as enduring as the iron they worked, a testament to the enduring power of craft and creativity. Let's first take a moment to appreciate the sheer ingenuity these blacksmiths brought to their craft. They were pioneers of metallurgy, pushing the boundaries of what could be done with the tools and knowledge available to them. In a time when the concept of technology wasn't even on the horizon, these artisans were already blazing trails with their innovative techniques. They took bog iron, essentially nature's rusty sponge, and transformed it into the swords, tools, and jewelry that would become the backbone of Viking society. And they did it all without the aid of modern machinery or technology. Talk about working smarter, not harder. But what makes their legacy truly remarkable is the economic impact they had. Blacksmiths were the silent engines of the Viking economy, crafting goods that were traded across a vast network that spanned from the icy waters of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of Constantinople. Imagine this: a ploughshare forged in a smoky Scandinavian workshop, ending up in a Byzantine market, traded for silk or spices. It's a reminder of just how interconnected the ancient world was, and how Viking blacksmiths were at the heart of it all. They were more than just local artisans, they were global players, crafting connections as much as they were crafting metal. Socially, the blacksmiths were as vital as they were versatile. Their workshops were more than places of work. They were community centres, where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and relationships were forged alongside the metal. They held a status that was almost paradoxical, humble in their day-to-day work, yet revered for the essential role they played. It's a bit like being the IT department in a 21st century office. Everyone needs you, no one quite understands what you do, but they all know they're in trouble without you. Culturally, the blacksmiths left an indelible mark on Viking society. They weren't just crafting weapons and tools, they were shaping identity and belief. The Mjolnir pendants and beautifully crafted jewelry they created were more than mere accessories. They were symbols steeped in meaning, connecting the wearer to the divine and to their own cultural identity. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about belonging and belief. Now, let's tackle the romanticized image of the Viking warrior, that axe-wielding marauder who's become the poster child for Viking history. The reality is that the Viking age was shaped as much by the blacksmiths as by the warriors. While the warriors might have been the ones making the history books, it was the blacksmiths who gave them the tools to do so. Without the blacksmith's forge, the Viking warrior would be just another guy with a bad haircut and a lot of bravado. The romantic notion of the Viking warrior is intoxicating, sure. Who wouldn't want to picture themselves as a fearless raider, sailing the high seas in search of glory? But the truth is, the real heroes were the ones working behind the scenes, ensuring that the warriors were well equipped for their exploits. It's a reminder that history is often written by the winners, but it's crafted by the makers. In pondering the legacy of the Viking blacksmith, we also come to understand the broader narrative of human innovation and creativity. These artisans were problem solvers, innovators, and artists, all rolled into one. They didn't just accept the world as it was, they shaped it, molded it, and in doing so, left a legacy that endures to this day. Their craftsmanship continues to influence modern perceptions of the Vikings, reminding us that the Viking Age was about more than just raids and conquests. It was a time of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. And at the center of it all were the blacksmiths, quietly forging the tools that would build an empire. So, as you close the door on this day, in the life of a Viking blacksmith, take a moment to appreciate the enduring legacy they left behind. Their innovations and craftsmanship continue to echo through history, reminding us that even the most unassuming figures can leave the most profound impact. In a world where warriors often take the spotlight, it's the makers, the blacksmiths, who are the true architects of history. And that, my friend, is a legacy worth remembering. The sharp tang of smoke hung in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of damp moss and the metallic whiff of iron. Welcome to the world of the Celtic warriors, a place where fierce fighters weren't just brandishing swords, but were also adept at wielding influence and managing resources. These warriors were as likely to engage in an impromptu wrestling match as they were to deliberate over the logistics of a cattle raid. Now, let's get one thing straight. If you're picturing a bunch of unruly barbarians running around in chaos, think again. The reality is that the Celtic tribes were more like your neighborhood's community association, albeit one where disputes might be settled with a spear rather than a sternly worded letter. These tribes, scattered across what we now know as Ireland, Scotland, and parts of mainland Europe, had a surprisingly structured political setup. They were organized into clans, each led by a chieftain who had a council of advisors. It wasn't all muscle and mayhem. These guys had meetings, and not just the kind that ended with someone getting tossed into the nearest bog. But before we dive too deep into politics, and let's be honest, no one really needs another history lesson that feels like a tax seminar. Let's talk style. Celtic warriors knew how to make an entrance. Forget about your run-of-the-mill armor. These folks had a penchant for turning heads with their unique fashion statements. We're talking about blue body paint known as woad, which not only gave them an intimidating look, but also supposedly had antiseptic properties. Whether it really helped with battlefield wounds, or was just a medieval version of war paint, who knows? What we do know is that it sent a message. We're here, we're blue, and we're ready to rumble. And let's not skip over the fact that these warriors had a flair for accessorizing. Their torques, those chunky neck rings you probably remember from some museum trip, weren't just for show. They were symbols of status and power, kind of like the ancient equivalent of a Rolex. Made from gold or bronze, they were as much about bling as they were about bravery. Now, while the warriors were out there flexing their woad-covered muscles, the Celtic economy was quietly humming along in the background. War wasn't just about glory, it was an economic necessity. Raids were a way to acquire cattle and slaves, which were the lifeblood of the Celtic economy. Cattle were more than just Big Macs on legs, they were the currency of the day. Forget Bitcoin back then, it was all about the moonie. The economics of war were as intricate as a Celtic knot. These warriors couldn't just storm another tribe's territory without a plan. They had to calculate the risks, the potential gains, and, of course, the cost of feeding and arming their retinue. We're talking about a logistical operation that would put a modern-day music festival to shame. Supplies had to be gathered, weapons crafted, and warriors fed. No small feat when your dinner plans involve a spit roast over an open flame rather than a quick drive-through. And let's talk about the weapons, because, frankly, no discussion about warriors is complete without them. Celtic swords were not just tools of war, they were works of art. Made from iron, they were often embellished with intricate designs reflecting the warrior's status and skill. These were not mass-produced. Each sword was a bespoke piece, crafted by skilled smiths who were the unsung heroes behind every battlefield victory. But what really set the Celtic warriors apart was their chariots. Yes, those two-wheeled contraptions weren't just for Roman generals or Ben-Hur. The Celts were masters of chariot warfare, using them to charge into battle with a speed and ferocity that must have been terrifying to behold. Imagine the scene, a thundering herd of horses, the warriors standing tall, their hair flying, blue paint glistening in the sunlight. It's a wonder anyone had the nerve to stand and fight. Now, let's debunk a myth or two. The Celts are often romanticized as noble savages, living in harmony with nature, guided by mystical druids. The truth? They were as complex and contradictory as any other society. Druids did play a significant role, but they were more like the intellectual elite than mystical forest dwellers. They were priests, judges, and teachers, wielding influence through knowledge and persuasion rather than magic spells. And while we're on the subject of magic, it's worth noting that the Celts were deeply spiritual, with a pantheon of gods and goddesses who demanded respect and, of course, the occasional sacrifice. Whether it was the harvest, a victory in battle, or just ensuring the sun would rise again, the gods needed appeasing. It was a world where the supernatural was woven into the fabric of everyday life, adding yet another layer to the already complex tapestry of Celtic society. In this world of warriors and druids, economics and enchantment, the Celtic tribes carved out a unique niche in history. They were not just fighters but also thinkers, traders, and strategists. They balanced the ferocity of the battlefield with the practicality of politics and economics. So next time you hear the phrase, Celtic warrior, remember that it wasn't just about the brawn. There was plenty of brain power behind those blue-painted faces, and a whole lot more going on than just swinging swords and shouting war cries. And speaking of swinging swords and shouting war cries, let's dive headfirst into the nitty-gritty of Celtic weaponry and tactics. The Celts were no strangers to the art of war, and their approach was anything but haphazard. Forget the image of wild-eyed berserkers charging blindly into battle. These warriors were as strategic as they were fierce. Let's start with the centerpiece of their battlefield brilliance, the chariot. Picture this, a two-wheeled marvel, drawn by a pair of horses and capable of turning on a dime, assuming ancient roads were anything but straight lines. These chariots weren't just transportation, they were the ancient equivalent of a Ferrari. They were designed for speed, maneuverability, and, of course, maximum impact. A Celtic chariot charge was like witnessing a cavalry blitz on steroids. The warriors would use these chariots to dart in and out of enemy lines, creating chaos and confusion. It was less about sheer force and more about striking fast and retreating just as quickly, leaving the enemy guessing and disoriented. The design of these chariots was no accident. The Celts employed lightweight construction for speed, often using iron-reinforced wooden frames. These chariots weren't cheap either. Maintaining a stable of war horses and a fleet of battle-ready chariots was enough to make any tribe's treasurer lose sleep. On average, a single chariot could cost the equivalent of a small herd of cattle, not to mention the expense of skilled craftsmen to build and maintain them. This was warfare with a price tag, folks, and only the wealthiest tribes could afford to go full throttle. Now, let's shatter the myth of the lone Celtic berserker, frothing at the mouth and swinging a sword with reckless abandon. Sure, the Celts had their moments of frenzied combat, but they were also tactical geniuses. Their warriors were trained to fight in tight-knit formations, using their long swords and shields with precision. The famous Celtic charge wasn't just a mad dash, it was a calculated strike, designed to break enemy lines with sheer force and speed. The Celts understood the importance of psychological warfare too. The woad-painted warriors, with their hair wild and their torques gleaming in the sunlight, were as much about intimidation as they were about combat prowess. The sight and sound of a Celtic army on the march was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened Roman legionary. And those infamous war cries? They were less about vocal warm-ups and more about rattling the nerves of their foes. Economically speaking, maintaining such a formidable fighting force wasn't a walk in the heather. The logistics of feeding, arming, and transporting warriors were daunting. A single campaign could require tons of grain to feed the warriors and their horses, not to mention the metal needed to forge weapons and armour. The Celts were savvy traders, often acquiring iron and other raw materials through barter or conquest. And let's not forget the human cost warriors had to be recruited, trained, and, if all went well, paid. This wasn't just a weekend hobby, it was a full-time commitment. Despite the romantic image of the Celtic warrior poet, the reality was that war was a brutal business, with economic implications that rippled through society. Every campaign meant diverting resources from agriculture and trade, and every warrior lost was a blow to the tribe's labour force. The spoils of war cattle, slaves, and plunder were essential to offset these costs and keep the tribe thriving. The Celts' strategic brilliance extended beyond the battlefield too. They were adept at forming alliances and understanding the political landscape. A well-timed alliance or a shrewd marriage could be as effective as any military maneuver. These warriors were not just muscle-bound brutes, they were diplomats and negotiators, capable of wielding influence as easily as a sword. As we delve deeper into the world of the Celts, it's clear that their reputation as wild, untamed warriors is only part of the story. They were a society that balanced the chaos of battle with the order of strategy, the thrill of the charge with the meticulous planning behind it. The next time you picture a Celtic warrior, remember that behind the blue paint and the fierce battle cries was a mind as sharp as any blade, plotting, planning, and always ready to seize the advantage. And stay tuned. There's more to uncover about these legendary fighters and the world they carved out for themselves. Now, let's shift the spotlight from the collective brilliance of the Celtic tribes to some of their most iconic figures, Boudica and Vercingetorix. These names might sound like they belong to a rock band specializing in ancient ballads, but rest assured, these leaders were anything but mellow. Their stories are woven into the tapestry of history with threads of defiance, tragedy, and, inevitably, a dash of Roman exaggeration. First up, meet Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe, a woman who decided that when life gives you Roman oppression, you make a rebellion out of it. We're talking about a lady who didn't just break the mold of what a leader should be, she smashed it with the force of a well-swung war club. After the Romans annexed her kingdom, flogged her, and mistreated her daughters, Boudica didn't just sit around knitting revenge fantasies. She went full throttle, leading an uprising that made the Romans wish they'd stayed home with a nice cup of wine. Boudica's rebellion in AD 60-61 was like a carefully choreographed dance of destruction, with an army reportedly numbering 100,000 strong. Though let's take Roman historian Tacitus's numbers with a grain of salt the size of Hadrian's Wall, she swept through Roman settlements like a storm in woad. Londinium, that's London, for all you modern map readers, Verulamium, Est Albans, and Camulodunum, Colchester, were left in flames. The Romans, who prided themselves on their orderly legions and straight roads, suddenly found themselves tangled in a Celtic whirlwind. But here's where the myth meets reality. While it's tempting to imagine Boudica as an invincible warrior queen, the truth is more tangled. Despite her initial victories, Boudica's forces were ultimately outmatched by Roman discipline and tactics. The final battle, likely near present-day West Midlands, saw her forces routed by Governor Suetonius Paulinus. And while her story has been retold with all the embellishments of a Hollywood epic, remember that much of what we know comes from Roman sources who had their own narrative to spin. Now, let's cross the channel to Gaul and meet Vercingetorix, a name that might sound like a tongue-twister but belonged to a man who twisted the Romans' plans into knots. This chieftain of the Arverni tribe became the face of Gallic resistance against Julius Caesar during the Gallic Wars around 52 BC. Vercingetorix was no mere footnote in Roman history, he was a thorn in Caesar's otherwise immaculate toga. Unlike Boudicca's fiery rebellion, Vercingetorix's campaign was all about playing the long game. He united the disparate Gallic tribes by emphasizing their shared hatred of Roman rule, a feat akin to herding cats, if the cats in question were armed and fiercely independent warriors. His tactics were a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, using scorched earth policies to deny the Romans resources and engaging in hit-and-run tactics that left Caesar cursing the day he crossed the Rubicon. The siege of Alesia became the climactic showdown of this saga. Besieged by Caesar's forces, Vercingetorix and his men held out against overwhelming odds, trapped within a fortified hilltop town. Roman engineers, displaying their usual flair for construction, built a double ring of fortifications around the town, because why have one wall when you can have two? Despite a valiant defence, Vercingetorix was eventually forced to surrender, reportedly riding out in full regalia to lay down his arms at Caesar's feet, perhaps the most dramatic mic drop in ancient history. So, why do these stories endure? Partly because they're a testament to human resilience, but also because the Romans liked a bit of drama with their history lessons. Roman historians such as Cassius Dio and Tacitus weren't above adding a little theatrical flair to their accounts, casting these Celtic leaders as both noble and tragic. They were the noble savages worthy foes who underscored Roman superiority when inevitably defeated. But the gritty reality beneath the legend is complex. Boudicca and Vercingetorix weren't just symbols of resistance, they were products of their time, shaped by the economic and political landscapes they navigated. Their rebellions were as much about survival as they were about freedom, driven by the harsh realities of Roman expansionism and the desire to preserve their way of life. Economically, both leaders faced the daunting task of sustaining their forces. Boudicca had to rally not just warriors, but also the resources needed to keep them fed and armed. Vercingetorix, meanwhile, orchestrated a coalition of tribes with varying interests, each with their own demands and expectations. The logistics alone were enough to make a modern-day supply chain manager break into a cold sweat. And then there's the aftermath. For Boudicca, it was a tragic end. Whether by self-poisoning or illness, her rebellion fizzled soon after her defeat. Her legacy, however, lived on, inspiring future generations as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Vercingetorix, on the other hand, got a one-way ticket to Rome, where he was paraded in Caesar's triumph before being executed. His legacy, like Boudicca's, endured as a symbol of defiance and the high cost of challenging an empire. So, here lies the truth. These legendary figures were as much a product of their storytelling as their actual deeds. The Romans, with their penchant for narrative flair, immortalized them as both noble adversaries and cautionary tales. But beneath the surface lies the real story of two leaders who dared to stand against the might of Rome, armed with little more than courage, conviction, and a whole lot of chutzpah. As we continue to explore the world of the Celtic warriors, remember that history is often a tapestry of fact and fiction, woven together by those who lived it and those who wrote it down. Boudicca and Vercingetorix may be larger-than-life figures, but their stories remind us that the fight for freedom is as old as time, and that sometimes even the most epic tales have a few footnotes worth reading. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover about these legendary fighters and the world they carved out for themselves. Ah, the Celts. Just when you thought you had them figured out, they throw you a curveball that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Into the world of Celtic warfare rituals, a place where practicality meets a splash of the macabre. So, if you've got a stomach for the bizarre, prepare to dive into the darker, ritualistic side of Celtic combat. Let's kick things off with headhunting. Yes, you heard that right, headhunting. Forget your corporate team-building exercises, the Celts had their own version, and it involved severed skulls. This wasn't just a gory pastime, it was a practice steeped in symbolism. To the Celts, the head was the seat of the soul, the essence of life itself. Capturing an enemy's head was akin to capturing their spirit, a trophy that symbolized victory and power. And in a world where reputation was everything, displaying these trophies was like having a 5-star Yelp review hanging over your fireplace. Now, let's not romanticize this too much. Before you imagine Celts as some kind of ancient Goths with skull decor, remember that this practice was deeply rooted in their belief system. Warriors weren't just collecting heads for kicks, they were securing their place in the afterlife, ensuring they'd be known as fearsome fighters both in this world and beyond. The Greeks and Romans, ever the critics, painted this practice as barbaric, a convenient way to underscore their own civilized superiority. But to the Celts, it was all about honor and legacy. Taking a step back, let's talk about the role of Druids in all this heady business. Far from the tree-hugging mystics of modern imagination, Druids were the intellectual powerhouses of Celtic society. They were the ones pulling the strings, interpreting omens, and advising chiefs on matters of war and peace. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a PR team and strategic advisor rolled into one. Their influence was unparalleled, and their endorsement of a warrior's deeds could make or break that warrior's legend. The Druids had a knack for ritual that rivaled any modern-day influencer's social media strategy. Their ceremonies were elaborate affairs, blending the sacred with the strategic. Take the Beltane festival, a ritual marking the beginning of the pastoral summer season. Warriors would leap over bonfires in a symbolic act of purification, believed to cleanse them of past sins and ready them for future battles. It was part spiritual, part practical, and all about ensuring the gods were on their side. Because, let's face it, you never want to head into battle with the deities giving you side-eye. Now, if you're picturing Druids as old men in white robes muttering incantations, you're only scratching the surface. They were educators, judges, and political advisors, holding sway over everything from tribal laws to wartime strategies. Their knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and law made them indispensable. Consider this, a Druid could spend up to 20 years learning their craft. That's longer than a modern PhD, folks, and they didn't even get to do it on Zoom. The Druids' role in warfare wasn't just about guiding spiritual practices. They were also the keepers of ancestral knowledge, the ones who remembered past battles and victories. Their counsel could change the course of a campaign, advising warriors on the best times to strike or retreat. They were the unsung heroes behind the scenes, the brains behind the brawn. Economically, war rituals played a significant role too, offering sacrifices, be it livestock or, in some accounts, human captives, was believed to ensure divine favor and a good harvest. This wasn't just about appeasing the gods, it was about maintaining the tribe's prosperity and stability. The connection between war and economy was inescapable, and the rituals reflected this intertwined relationship. Now, let's debunk another myth, the notion that all Celtic warriors were wild-eyed berserkers with no sense of strategy. The truth is, their rituals and practices were often calculated decisions designed to bolster morale and intimidate foes. The infamous Celtic charge was as much about psychological warfare as it was about physical combat. Picture the scene, warriors adorned in colourful cloaks, wielding weapons with ornate designs and unleashing a cacophony of war cries. It was less about chaos and more about creating an overwhelming spectacle that would send shivers down the spine of any enemy. Let's not forget the role of women in this warrior society. While men often took the spotlight with their martial exploits, women were far from the sidelines. In some tribes, women fought alongside men, wielding swords and shields with equal ferocity. They were also key players in the social and ritualistic aspects of warfare. The legend of Scathach, a warrior woman who trained heroes in the art of combat, speaks volumes about the respect and authority women could wield. Scathach wasn't just a teacher, she was a symbol of empowerment in a time when such stories were rare. The social fabric of Celtic warfare was a complex tapestry, where honour, economy, and spirituality were inextricably linked. Each raid, each battle, was not just a test of strength, but a reaffirmation of identity and belief. The rituals that accompanied warfare were as much about the living as they were about the dead, a way to connect past, present, and future in a cycle as eternal as the Celtic knot. As we peel back the layers of myth and reality, it's clear that Celtic warriors were more than just fighters. They were part of a culture that celebrated the art of war as a vital, almost sacred endeavour. So, whether it was headhunting or leaping over Beltane fires, these practices were woven into the very essence of Celtic life. They remind us that history is never just black and white, but a spectrum of beliefs, strategies, and stories that continue to fascinate us today. So, keep your woad at the ready and stay tuned for more tales from the Celtic world, where the line between legend and reality is as fluid as the swirling mists of history. There's more to uncover, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. While the mists of history swirl around the Celtic warriors, their legacy is anything but obscure. These fierce fighters, with their penchant for blue paint and headhunting, have left a mark on the modern imagination that's as indelible as the woad they once wore. But how did they make the jump from historical reality to pop culture icons? Buckle up, because we're about to unravel the tangled web of myth, legend, and a touch of Hollywood magic. First, let's get something straight. The image of the Celtic warrior as a wild, untamed force of nature is as much a creation of later storytellers as it is a reflection of historical fact. The Romans, with their knack for self-promotion, were quick to paint their foes as barbaric, reinforcing their own narrative of civilized superiority. But this caricature has proven irresistible to generations of writers, filmmakers, and, yes, history buffs. The allure of the noble savage, battling against overwhelming odds, is a powerful narrative that taps into our deepest fascination with rebellion and resistance. Fast forward a few centuries, and the Celts have become fixtures in the pantheon of fantasy. From Tolkien's Middle-earth to the mythical lands of Arthurian legend, their influence is everywhere. The very idea of a warrior culture, deeply connected to nature and mysticism, is catnip for anyone crafting a tale of epic proportions. But while the Celts might inspire visions of enchanted forests and gallant quests, the reality was often less glamorous. Forget knights in shining armor. Life was more about managing livestock and counting cattle than jousting tournaments. Economically speaking, the Celts were practical to a fault. Their raids and battles weren't just for glory, they were often motivated by the need to secure resources and ensure the tribe's survival. Yet, in the retelling, the gritty details of cattle raids and subsistence farming are often edited out, replaced by grand tales of heroism and valor. It's as if history went through a medieval Instagram filter, smoothing out the rough edges and adding a touch of sepia-toned nostalgia. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The romanticized view of the Celts serves a purpose, offering a lens through which to explore timeless themes of honor, loyalty, and the fight for freedom. It's a narrative that resonates precisely because it speaks to universal human experiences. Who hasn't felt the urge to rail against the status quo, to defend what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable? In this way, the Celtic warriors are less a product of historical fact and more a mirror reflecting our own desires and fears. Now, let's dive into how these ancient warriors have been immortalized on screen. From Mel Gibson's Braveheart, which, despite its historical inaccuracies, captured the spirit of defiance, to more recent series like Outlander, the Celts continue to captivate audiences. Their stories, though often embellished, serve as a reminder of the enduring power of narrative to shape our understanding of the past. The irony, of course, is that while these depictions might stray from historical fact, they often succeed in capturing the emotional truth of the Celtic experience, the struggle for autonomy in the face of overwhelming external pressures. In the realm of literature, Celtic mythology has provided rich fodder for countless authors. The stories of Cuchulainn, the epic warrior of Irish myth, and the tragic romance of Tristan and Isolde have been retold and reimagined, each version adding new layers to these timeless tales. It's testament to the Celts' storytelling prowess that their legends have survived, morphing and evolving to remain relevant in each new era. Yet, it's crucial to acknowledge the economic and political realities that often get glossed over in these retellings. The Celtic tribes were not isolated pockets of resistance, but part of a complex web of trade and alliances. They navigated a landscape shaped by shifting power dynamics and resource scarcity. Their warriors were as much products of their environment as they were shapers of it. While we may romanticize their battles, it's essential to remember that these conflicts were often driven by necessity as much as by valor. The Celts' legacy also offers valuable lessons about the power of narrative in shaping identity. Their stories remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living, breathing tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. The tales we choose to tell and how we choose to tell them reveal as much about our present as they do about our past. As we wrap up this journey through the world of the Celtic warriors, we're left with a final thought. History is a curious blend of fact and fiction, myth and reality. The Celts, with their vibrant culture and fierce spirit, remind us that the stories we tell can transcend time, capturing the essence of a people long after the dust of their battles has settled. So, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps dreaming of blue-painted warriors charging into battle, remember that while the past may be a foreign country, its echoes resonate in the stories we cherish and the legends we pass down. The legacy of the Celtic warriors endures, not because they were flawless heroes, but because their stories, in all their complexity and contradiction, continue to speak to the heart of what it means to be human. And in a world that often feels as chaotic as a battlefield, that's a legacy worth holding on to. Marie Curie wasn't always the scientific powerhouse of Nobel fame. Once, she was just a young woman in Poland, known as Maria Skłodowska, wrestling with the practicalities of a life that seemed to have been scripted by a playwright with a penchant for irony. Born in 1867 in Warsaw, a city under Russian control, she was the youngest of 5 children in a family that prized education like some families prize heirlooms. Her father, a physics and mathematics instructor, could wax poetic about the wonders of the universe, while her mother, a headmistress, ran a tight ship at home. Education was their currency, though, in a world where being a woman in science was about as fashionable as wearing socks with sandals. It wasn't the easiest currency to spend. As Maria grew up, she had her sights set on higher education, but there was a slight hiccup. Universities in her homeland were closed to women. That didn't stop her from pursuing knowledge like a detective pursuing a lead. She joined a clandestine institution called the Flying University, a name that sounds more Harry Potter than Harvard. This underground network of learning was about as legal as a pirate radio station, but for Maria it was a lifeline. It operated on the down low, moving locations faster than you could say academic freedom, and offered courses led by some of the brightest minds who dared to think outside the Tsar's neatly drawn lines. Fast forward to the early 1890s, and Maria had saved up enough to make the leap to Paris, where the doors of the Sorbonne stood wide open for women, well, as wide as they could be, considering the societal norms of the time. The journey itself was a bit of a comedy of errors. Picture this: a young woman with a mind full of dreams and a suitcase that weighed more than her entire budget for the first year. Yes, she packed her earthly belongings with the precision of someone preparing for a moon landing. But when you're moving to another country to study, what's a few extra pounds of books and family mementos? Arriving in Paris, Maria, now preferring the French version of her name Marie, found herself living on a shoestring budget that would make even the most frugal of students weep. Her accommodations were Spartan. Imagine a garret so cold in winter that water froze by her bedside, which seems almost romantic if you're reading about it from the comfort of a heated room. Marie's diet wasn't much better, consisting mainly of bread, butter, and the occasional cup of tea, a menu that sounds more like the offerings of a poorly stocked kitchen than a future Nobel laureate's sustenance. And speaking of Nobel laureates, Paris was a hotbed of scientific activity, a city buzzing with intellectual chatter and the clinking of test tubes. Marie dove into her studies with the enthusiasm of a kid in a candy store, albeit a candy store filled with equations and laboratory experiments rather than sweets. Nevertheless, she quickly realized that being a woman in science was like being the proverbial canary in a coal mine. The Sorbonne wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for female students, but Marie had more than enough grit to navigate the male-dominated halls with her head held high. The economic context of 1890s Europe added another layer of complexity to her story. The continent was in the throes of the Long Depression, a period that lasted from 1873 to 1896, which meant that cash was tighter than the lid on a pickle jar. For Marie, every franc counted, and she had to be crafty. She tutored in the evenings to make ends meet, squeezing more hours out of a day than seemed humanly possible. Her dedication was a testament to her tenacity, and it paid off when she earned her degree in physics in 1893, coming in first in her class. A year later, she added a mathematics degree to her collection, finishing second this time, proving that she was consistently exceptional. But let's not sugarcoat it. The road to academia was paved with challenges, not least of which was the pervasive skepticism about women's intellectual capabilities. The so-called weaker sex was often relegated to the sidelines, expected to pursue more appropriate vocations like teaching or nursing, not delving into the mysteries of physics and chemistry. Society's expectations were as rigid as a Victorian corset, but Marie was having none of it. She was determined to carve out her niche in the scientific community, even if it meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. Marie's journey to Paris, and her foray into academia were not just about breaking personal boundaries, they were about shattering societal ones. She was part of a broader movement of women who, against all odds and societal norms, were beginning to claim their rightful place in the world of science. Her story is a reminder that behind every legendary figure, there's a human being who tackled life's absurdities with a blend of humour, grit, and an unyielding passion for knowledge. As we continue to explore her life, we'll see that Marie Curie wasn't just a pioneer in her field, she was a trailblazer who left an indelible mark on the world, one discovery at a time. Marie Curie was just getting started. With her academic accolades tucked securely under her belt, she wasn't content to rest on her laurels. Far from it. Marie was about to dive headfirst into the world of radioactivity, a term she would coin herself. Now, if you think radioactivity is just something that makes your Geiger counter go click, 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 well, buckle up. It was about to become the buzzword of the century thanks to our trailblazer. In the late 1890s, Marie was ready to embark on research that would set her apart. Picture a small, cramped lab that looked more like a scene from a Sherlock Holmes novel than a place of scientific breakthroughs. The peeling walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the equipment was so outdated even Frankenstein might have turned up his nose. But it was here that Marie, with her husband Pierre Curie, who was equally brilliant and just as dedicated, began their groundbreaking work on radioactivity. The dynamic duo was about to pull a scientific rabbit out of the hat, only this rabbit would glow in the dark. Their research focused on uranium, a substance that had already piqued Marie's interest because it emitted rays that no one could quite explain. Armed with a curiosity sharper than a Swiss army knife, Marie got to work. She discovered that these emissions were not a result of chemical reactions, but something altogether different. It was like finding out your toaster had Wi-Fi completely unexpected, but with potential to change the game. In 1898, after what must have felt like an eternity of painstaking experiments, Marie discovered polonium, named after her beloved Poland, because what good is a discovery if you can't wave the flag of your homeland over it? A few months later, she identified radium, a substance so powerful it seemed to defy the laws of nature itself. It was like finding a unicorn in your backyard, except this unicorn had the power to light up a room and wreak havoc on your health if you weren't careful. Now, let's talk about the lab conditions. Forget about Bunsen burners and gleaming countertops. Marie's workspace was more like a scientist's version of a haunted house. The lab's drafty corners and crumbling plaster were far from inspiring, unless you were aiming for an avant-garde art installation. And when it came to co-workers, well, let's just say the mice running around were the least of her worries. She was surrounded by a scientific community that often viewed her with skepticism, which was about as comforting as a soggy blanket on a cold winter's night. The financial strain was another beast entirely. Research wasn't cheap, and radium wasn't just lying around in generous quantities. To isolate a single gram of radium, Marie and Pierre had to process tons of pitchblende, a mineral that sounds like it should be the villain in a Tolkien novel. They sourced it from the waste products of uranium mines, which is about as glamorous as it sounds. Imagine sifting through literal tons, about 10 to be precise, of this stuff, just to get a tiny amount of radium. It's akin to mining for gold with a teaspoon. Money was tight, tighter than a drum, and the Curies had to scrape by on a shoestring budget that would make even the most frugal miser wince. The cost of their experiments was astronomical for the time, and funding was scarce. The Curies didn't have the luxury of government grants or corporate sponsorships. Nope, they were the original DIY scientists hustling to make ends meet and advance their research. It's a testament to their dedication and sheer stubbornness that they persevered despite these challenges. Academic rivalries added a dash of drama to the mix. The scientific community of the late 19th century was a hotbed of competition, with egos larger than life. Scientists were jostling for recognition like sprinters at the starting line. Marie and Pierre had to navigate these turbulent waters while keeping their eyes on the prize. It was a world where every discovery was a race, every experiment a potential headline, and every setback a chance for rivals to pounce. Despite these obstacles, Marie's work was nothing short of revolutionary. Her discoveries laid the groundwork for future research in nuclear physics and chemistry, fields that would go on to change the world in ways even she couldn't have imagined. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, Marie was still in the thick of it, battling the odds with the tenacity of a prizefighter in the ring. The Curie's work on radioactivity wasn't just about the science. It was about pushing boundaries, challenging norms and, let's be honest, driving themselves to the brink in pursuit of knowledge. They were the original power couple, giving new meaning to the phrase, partners in crime. Crime, in this case, being the audacious act of daring to dream big and follow through no matter the cost. So, what did all this mean for the world at large? Well, radioactivity would go on to be used in everything from medical treatments to energy production, and let's not forget its darker applications in warfare. But that's a story for another day. For now, we're left with an indelible image of Marie, standing in her ramshackle lab, surrounded by the glow of her discoveries, proving once and for all that passion and perseverance can illuminate even the darkest corners of the scientific world. Radioactivity was just the tip of the iceberg for Marie and Pierre Curie, two scientific renegades in a world that still preferred its geniuses to come in singular packages, preferably male and unencumbered by anything as inconvenient as a spouse. But the Curies were poised to shatter the stereotype like a beaker in a poorly executed chemistry experiment. Their marriage was a union of minds as much as hearts, a partnership that would redefine the concept of power couple long before the term was even coined. Now, it would be easy to paint Marie as the lone genius, to isolate her in the glow of radium's eerie luminescence, but that would be a disservice to Pierre, her partner in scientific crime. The truth is, they were a dynamic duo, each bringing something unique to the table or lab bench, as it were. While Marie possessed a dogged determination and an eye for detail that would make Sherlock Holmes envious, Pierre had a knack for theoretical insights and was as fascinated by the mysterious properties of crystals as a kid in a candy store. Together, they were unstoppable. Their collaboration was the stuff of legends. In 1903, the Curies, along with Henri Becquerel, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their joint research on radiation phenomena. This made Marie the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, a milestone that must have sent shockwaves through the scientific community like a well-aimed lightning bolt. Suddenly, the world had to grapple with the idea that intellect didn't come with a gender label, and that perhaps, just perhaps, two heads were indeed better than one. Yet, despite the accolades, the Curies were far from the lap of luxury. Their economic reality was about as glamorous as their lab conditions. The monetary reward from the Nobel Prize was a welcome relief, but let's not pretend it was a ticket to Easy Street. The prize amounted to about 70,000 francs, which sounds impressive until you consider the cost of scientific research at the time. It was like winning a gift card to a high-end restaurant when what you really needed was a year's worth of groceries. The media, of course, had a field day with their story. The idea of a husband and wife team making groundbreaking discoveries was as irresistible as a soap opera plot twist. Journalists couldn't get enough of the romantic notion of a starry-eyed couple changing the world from their dingy lab. But the truth was more nuanced. The Curie's marriage was as much about practicalities as it was about passion, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared goals and mutual respect. Their joint achievements didn't just earn them a place in the annals of science, they also sparked societal change. The Curie's work laid the foundation for the burgeoning field of atomic physics, a discipline that would later play a pivotal role in both medicine and energy. Their discovery that atoms weren't the smallest, indivisible units of matter opened the door to a new understanding of the universe. It was like discovering a secret passage in a house you thought you knew inside out. But while the Curies were busy revolutionizing science, they were also challenging the status quo in other ways. Marie, in particular, became a symbol of female empowerment, a living testament to the idea that women could hold their own in the male-dominated world of science. Her very existence was a challenge to the patriarchal norms of the day, a reminder that talent couldn't be confined to societal expectations. Of course, the Curies weren't without their detractors. The scientific community, as welcoming as a porcupine at a balloon factory, had its share of skeptics. Some critics questioned whether Marie's contributions were truly her own, or simply an extension of Pierre's work. It was a classic case of the era's pervasive sexism, a misguided attempt to downplay her role. But anyone who took a closer look at their meticulous research logs and experimental notes could see that Marie was no mere assistant, she was a driving force in her own right. Their discoveries also had broader implications for society. The newfound understanding of radioactivity would eventually lead to both beneficial and destructive applications, from cancer treatments to nuclear weapons. In many ways, the Curie's work was a double-edged sword, a reminder that scientific progress comes with its own set of ethical dilemmas. It was as if they had handed humanity a powerful tool, leaving it to us to decide how to wield it. The media's obsession with the Curies' partnership was a double-edged sword as well. On one hand, it brought much-needed attention to their work, but on the other, it often overshadowed the substance of their discoveries with sensationalism. The press loved to play up the image of the romantic scientists, framing their partnership as a love story more suited to a Hollywood script than a laboratory. While there's no denying the romantic appeal of their collaboration, it was the practical, nitty-gritty details of their research that truly made an impact. And let's not forget the societal context of the time. The early 20th century was a period of rapid change, a time when the old guard of science was being challenged by new ideas and fresh perspectives. The Curies were at the forefront of this revolution, not just because of their discoveries, but because of what they represented: a break from tradition, a shift towards a more inclusive and collaborative approach to science. In the years following their Nobel win, the Curies continued to push the boundaries of what was possible. They remained steadfast in their dedication to their work, even as they navigated the complexities of fame and public scrutiny. Their relentless pursuit of knowledge, coupled with their unwavering commitment to each other, made them icons not just of science, but of human perseverance. As the world began to wake up to the potential of radioactivity, the Curies found themselves at the center of a seismic shift in scientific thought. Their discoveries had opened a Pandora's box of possibilities, a world where atoms could be split and energy could be harnessed in ways previously unimaginable. It was a brave new world, and the Curies were its trailblazers. So as we continue to unravel the story of Marie Curie, let's remember that her journey was never a solitary one. It was a journey shared with Pierre, a partnership that transcended the traditional boundaries of marriage and science. Together, they challenged the norms of their time, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire and provoke, a testament to the power of collaboration and the enduring quest for knowledge. Marie Curie's story didn't end with her sharing that Nobel Prize with Pierre and Henri Becquerel. No, that was just the curtain raiser. The real drama unfolded in 1911 when Marie, now a widow, upped the ante by clinching her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. And if you think the Nobel Committee had finally learned to handle their laureates with grace and sophistication, think again. Their blunders were about as subtle as a bull in a china shop. Let's set the scene. It's 1911, and Marie is still grappling with the fallout from Pierre's tragic death in 1906. Add to that the fact she's now a single mother of two, managing a lab and battling the effects of radiation exposure, her own body slowly becoming a testament to the dangerous brilliance of her discoveries. Yet, despite these Herculean challenges, she persisted, proving once again that she was made of sterner stuff than any of her contemporaries gave her credit for. Now, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to her in recognition of her services to the advancement of chemistry by the discovery of the elements, radium and polonium, by the isolation of radium and the study of the nature and compounds of this remarkable element. A mouthful, sure, but it was the scientific equivalent of a standing ovation. This made her the first person to ever win 2 Nobel Prizes, a feat that sounded as improbable then as it does now. But let's not get swept away just yet. Enter the Nobel Committee, who, despite being the gatekeepers of scientific glory, sometimes acted like they were running an amateur talent show. Their initial attempt to sideline Marie's contributions was as awkward as a cat in a dog park. They actually considered withholding her prize due to a scandalous affair she was rumoured to have had with a fellow scientist, Paul Langevin, which the tabloids relished more than a cat does cream. Imagine that, her intellect reduced to gossip fodder, her achievements overshadowed by whispers of impropriety. Yet Marie, in her infinite wisdom, wasn't about to let a bunch of scandal-mongering busybodies dictate her legacy. She attended the Nobel ceremony anyway, a move that sent a message louder than any megaphone could. Her contributions to science were paramount, and not even the weight of public disapproval could diminish them. This was a woman who had faced bigger challenges than a few wagging tongues and lived to tell the tale. Marie's scientific success was juxtaposed with her personal struggles, offering a stark contrast to the public's romanticized view of her life. The media thrived on the image of the solitary genius, a woman who'd single-handedly cracked the code of the atom. But the reality was far grittier. Persistent sexism dogged her every step, a constant reminder that even in the enlightened halls of science, prejudice was alive and well. And then there were the health issues, those uninvited guests at the banquet of her success. Marie was practically glowing with achievement, and not in a good way. Her research had unwittingly turned her into a human light show thanks to the radiation exposure she endured during her experiments. It was like she'd been handed a double-edged sword, one side gleaming with potential, the other cutting her down with its invisible bite. Her notebooks, still radioactive to this day, serve as eerie reminders of the price she paid for her discoveries. While the world marveled at her glowing success, Marie was living proof of the grim realities of long-term radiation exposure. Her health deteriorated over the years, and she suffered from chronic illnesses, including cataracts and a host of other radiation-induced ailments. Yet the gallows humour of it all was that her suffering was indirectly tied to the very work that had earned her the highest accolades. It's as if the universe had a twisted sense of humour, rewarding her brilliance with a side of suffering. On the political front, Marie's achievements played out against a backdrop of shifting gender dynamics, with women slowly inching their way into fields previously barred to them. Her success was both a beacon and a burden, held up as an example of what women could achieve while simultaneously used as an excuse to argue that she was an outlier, a unique exception rather than proof of women's potential. And let's not forget the economic context. The world was on the cusp of the First World War, a time when resources were strained and scientific funding was as scarce as hen's teeth. Despite this, Marie managed to secure resources for her research, a testament to her tenacity and the undeniable importance of her work. Her ability to navigate these choppy waters was nothing short of miraculous, a tribute to her resilience and strategic acumen. In essence, Marie Curie was a woman of contradictions, hailed as a luminary in a time when women were often denied the simplest of scientific opportunities, yet plagued by the very success that should have been her triumph. Her dual Nobel Prizes were not just accolades, but symbols of her relentless pursuit of knowledge, marred by the scars of her battles with societal norms and personal health. As we peel back the layers of her story, one thing becomes clear. Marie Curie's legacy is not merely one of scientific achievement, but of resilience, courage, and an unyielding spirit in the face of adversity. And as we leave her story for now, poised on the brink of even greater challenges, remember this: Marie Curie was not just a scientist, she was a force of nature. And like nature, she was both beautiful and terrifying in her complexity, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is not for the faint-hearted. Stay tuned, because the story of Marie Curie is far from over. Marie Curie's story, like any good epic, didn't bow out quietly. Instead, it barreled into World War I with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. You see, when the world was tearing itself apart, Marie decided it was time to stitch it back together, literally, by revolutionizing battlefield medicine. With Europe embroiled in chaos, Curie rolled up her sleeves and got to work on a project that would save countless lives, mobile X-ray units, or as they were affectionately called, little Curies. These mobile units were not your typical hospital on wheels. Picture a truck, part science lab, part ambulance, trundling over the bomb-scarred terrain of war-torn France. It was more MacGyver than McDreamy, but it did the job. Marie, ever the multitasker, not only designed these units but also trained over 150 women to operate them, turning housewives into radiologists faster than you could say, "Emming she." It was a logistical triumph, considering she had to scrounge for resources in a country more focused on artillery than X-rays. The economic context was grim. France was bleeding money, throwing francs at the war effort like confetti at a parade. Yet Marie, undeterred by the scarcity of funds, managed to convince the military to support her vision. Her knack for persuasion was almost as impressive as her scientific prowess. She even dipped into her personal reserves of radium to fund the venture, a move akin to pawning your grandmother's pearls for a good cause. The result? By the end of the war, her units had examined over 1 million soldiers. Not a bad return on investment for a woman whose achievements were often overshadowed by her gender. Speaking of overshadowing, let's wade into the murky waters of myth versus reality. Marie Curie, The lone genius, the martyr to science, the woman who glowed both metaphorically and literally. It's a narrative as intoxicating as a vintage Bordeaux, but like most legends, it's only half the story. Yes, she was a trailblazer, but she was also a human being, flesh and bone, with flaws and frailties. Her resilience was legendary, yet it was born out of necessity rather than choice. The reality is that she juggled a career, a family, and a legacy while battling the systemic sexism that haunted her every step. Her life was less fairy tale and more gritty drama, the kind where the heroine wins but not without paying a steep price. And what of her legacy? Well, Marie's impact stretches far beyond the confines of her own time. Her work paved the way for future generations of scientists, women and men alike, challenging the status quo and expanding the horizons of what was possible. She didn't just open doors, she bulldozed through them, leaving a path for others to follow. Her daughters, particularly Irene Curie, continued her work, proving that genius can indeed run in the family. Irene's own Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935 was a testament to the scientific dynasty Marie had unwittingly founded. In the grand tapestry of history, Marie Curie's story is a vibrant thread, woven through with both triumph and tragedy. Her enduring influence is felt in every lab, every hospital, and every conversation about the role of women in science. She's a reminder that progress is often born from struggle, that the road to discovery is fraught with challenges, and that sometimes the greatest achievements come with the greatest costs. And let's not forget the modern perspective. Today, Marie Curie is a household name, her life dissected in documentaries, books, and even a few awkwardly staged plays. But beyond the accolades and the dramatizations, her story remains a powerful testament to human perseverance. She's a figurehead for the curious, the determined, and the defiant. And while we've sanitized her narrative for public consumption, smoothing out the rough edges and ignoring the complexities of her reality, her true legacy lies in her relentless pursuit of knowledge, her refusal to accept the status quo, and her ability to inspire generations. So, as we draw the curtain on Marie Curie's story, let's do so with a nod to her tenacity and a wink at the absurdity of it all. Because if there's one thing her life teaches us, it's that history isn't just a series of events, it's a collection of choices, sacrifices, and, yes, a bit of radioactive glow. In the end, Marie Curie was more than just a scientist. She was a force of nature, a catalyst for change, and proof that even in a world of uncertainty, one person can make an indelible mark. Hull, 1759, a town not exactly known for its glamour, but certainly for its bustling docks and the unmistakable aroma of fish. It's here, amidst the clamour of trade and the salty sea breeze, that William Wilberforce first lets out a cry, destined to echo through history. Born into a life of privilege, young William's cradle was more silver spoon than wooden rattle. His family was knee-deep in wealth, courtesy of a thriving merchant business, and it was this economic cushion that would pad the early years of his life. Now, let's not sugarcoat it, little Willie, as his friends might have called him if he allowed it, wasn't exactly a poster child for hardship. His upbringing was bathed in luxury, a fact that would later ruffle a few feathers when he championed the destitute. But hey, hypocrisy is just a good PR plan waiting to happen, right? The Wilberforce family had the kind of cash flow that enabled them to send their son to the finest schools, where he could mingle with the future movers and shakers of the British Empire. Fast forward to 1776, when Wilberforce, at the tender age of 17, packed his bags for Cambridge. And not just any old college, he was headed to St. John's, one of the grand old institutions that had been churning out brainiacs since 1511. Here, Wilberforce met a fellow named William Pitt, soon to be the younger, to distinguish him from his father, who had the audacity to be Prime Minister first. Pitt was as much a prodigy as Wilberforce was privileged, and the two formed a bond that was less bromance and more alliance of the Titans. At Cambridge, Wilberforce was more interested in the social scene than in heading the books. He had a penchant for theatre, which, let's be honest, was probably more about the drama off stage than on it. He was known for his sharp wit and even sharper tongue, traits that would serve him well in the cutthroat world of politics. One might say he was the life of the party, but with a brain to match the banter. His time at Cambridge wasn't all pints and playhouses, though. He managed to leave with a degree, which is more than some of us can say after a fun night out. It was during these rambunctious college days, that Wilberforce decided to take a plunge into politics, a move as unexpected as the weather in Hull. In 1780, at the age of just 21, he was elected Member of Parliament for Kingston upon Hull. It's the kind of thing that might make modern 20-somethings feel inadequate, but hey, different times. The election was less about democratic choice and more about who could afford the biggest bribe, and Wilberforce's family wealth certainly helped him outspend the competition. Wilberforce's early political career was a comedy of errors, a real-life sitcom where he bumbled through the halls of power, learning the ropes and often tripping over them. One of his early speeches in Parliament was so inaudible that it drew more snickers than applause. It's as if the universe was giving him a nudge, saying, "Not so fast, kiddo." But young William wasn't one to be deterred by a few awkward moments. He was determined to make his mark, and if that meant stumbling a few times, then so be it. In these formative years, Wilberforce's naivety was both his charm and his Achilles heel. He was idealistic to a fault, a trait that endeared him to some and exasperated others. He once attempted to introduce a bill that was essentially a long-winded complaint about the high taxes on hair powder. And yes, hair powder was a big deal back then, but maybe not the hill to die on. Nevertheless, these early missteps were part and parcel of his political education, a reminder that even the most revered leaders started somewhere awkward. Yet, amidst the faux pas and the fumbles, there were glimpses of the Wilberforce who would later become a moral compass for the nation. Beneath the veneer of privilege and the misjudged political moves was a young man with a growing awareness of the world's injustices. His friendship with Pitt was instrumental, as the two often debated the pressing issues of the day, planting the seeds of reform in Wilberforce's mind. They were like a historical odd couple, with Pitt's political savvy balancing Wilberforce's idealism. So there you have it, the early life of William Wilberforce, a mix of privilege, potential, and a penchant for the theatrical. His journey was just beginning, and while he might have stumbled out of the gate, it was all part of the ride. From the hullabaloo of Hull to the historic halls of Cambridge, these formative years set the stage for what was to come. Stay tuned for more escapades and enlightenment in the life of a man who would go on to challenge the very foundations of society, all while keeping his sense of humour intact. As Wilberforce navigated the early days of his political life, something curious began to stir beneath his well-tailored exterior. Turns out, a life of privilege and powdered wigs wasn't quite enough for our young parliamentarian. Amidst the social whirl of London's elite, where the gossip was as rich as the food, Wilberforce found himself yearning for something more substantial, like a gravitas that couldn't be bought at the tailor's. Into the late 1780s, a time when Britain was abuzz with change, and not just the kind that jingled in one's pocket. The Industrial Revolution was cranking gears and smokestacks, forever altering the landscape and the lives of those who toiled in its shadow. Wilberforce, too, was primed for a revolution of sorts, though his would be of a decidedly spiritual nature. In 1785, during a leisurely tour of Europe, because why not when you have the means, Wilberforce's life took a turn as unexpected as a plot twist in a Dickens novel. On this fateful journey, he crossed paths with Isaac Milner, a man whose intellect was as formidable as his name was forgettable. Milner was a mathematician and a theologian, a real two-for-one deal in the world of 18th-century academia. As they travelled, Milner's conversations about faith and morality began to seep into Wilberforce's consciousness, sparking an inner dialogue that would eventually roar like a lion. Returning to England, Wilberforce found himself in the throes of a profound spiritual awakening, a transformation that would set him on a path far removed from the frivolity of his earlier years. It's worth noting that this wasn't your typical Sunday best kind of epiphany. No, this was a full-blown existential reckoning, the kind that makes you question every silk-lined lapel and silver spoon you've ever owned. Wilberforce emerged from this period of introspection with a newfound resolve and a moral compass that pointed squarely towards social reform. Now, let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of what Wilberforce was about to undertake. The 18th-century British political scene was a beast, and not the cuddly kind. It was a landscape dominated by entrenched interests, where the idea of abolishing the slave trade was about as popular as a rainstorm at a garden party. Slavery was big business, and big business had deep pockets. But Wilberforce wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, even if it meant ruffling the feathers of some very wealthy birds. In 1787, Wilberforce made a decision that would define his career and, indeed, his entire legacy. He would dedicate himself to the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, a Herculean task that would require not just political savvy, but also a stamina that rivaled that of the most seasoned marathoner. Enter the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a group of like-minded individuals who shared Wilberforce's vision and his penchant for uphill battles. This was the Avengers of Abolition, minus the capes and with a whole lot more paperwork. The logistics of rallying support in the 18th century were as cumbersome as a corset. Forget social media blitzes or viral hashtags. This was the age of pamphlets, petitions, and public meetings, convincing the British public, and, more critically, Parliament, that the slave trade was a moral abomination required the kind of grassroots campaign that would make modern political strategists break out in hives. Wilberforce and his team had to find ways to resonate with people who, for the most part, were more concerned with their own livelihoods than the plight of distant strangers. The costs were staggering. Political campaigns in the 1780s weren't just about speeches and handshakes. They were about influence, and influence often came with a hefty price tag. Wilberforce's personal fortune was a significant asset, allowing him to finance these efforts in a manner that would make even the most generous Kickstarter backer blush. It's estimated that Wilberforce spent the equivalent of several £100,000 in today's money on his abolitionist crusade. And you thought your coffee habit was expensive. Wilberforce faced rivals who were as determined to maintain the status quo as he was to dismantle it. The pro-slavery bloc was powerful, fortified by economic interests that saw the abolition movement as a direct threat to their profits. Wilberforce had to navigate a minefield of vested interests, cajoling and convincing with the kind of deftness that would have impressed a snake charmer. His speeches in the House of Commons became legendary, not just for their eloquence, but for their unrelenting moral conviction. He spoke with the fervour of a man who'd seen the light and was determined to share it, even if it meant shining it directly into the eyes of his detractors. Yet, for all the grandeur of Parliament, the real work of abolition was often done in less glamorous venues. Town halls and taverns became the settings for impassioned debates, where Wilberforce and his allies engaged with the public, challenging them to see the world differently. It was a grueling, unglamorous endeavour, one that required a thick skin and a willingness to endure more than a few jeers and jabs. Amidst this whirlwind of political activity, Wilberforce remained steadfast in his mission, buoyed by a sense of purpose that transcended the fleeting allure of power and prestige. His spiritual awakening had ignited a fire within him, one that burned with a clarity and intensity that few could match. As the years went by, Wilberforce's dedication to the cause only grew stronger, driven by a belief that humanity's better angels could, indeed, triumph over its baser instincts. And so, the stage was set for one of history's most enduring sagas, a tale of perseverance, principle, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Wilberforce was no longer just a man of privilege or a socialite with a penchant for theatre. He was a reformer, a pioneer, and, above all, a man with an unshakable vision for a more equitable world. As he continued to fight the good fight, one couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter would hold for this remarkable figure, a story still unfolding, with plenty of twists and turns yet to come. Stay tuned, because Wilberforce's journey is far from over. As Wilberforce continued to fight his righteous battle, the stage was anything but set in stone. The late 18th century was a time when the world seemed to be spinning faster on its axis, thanks to two rather seismic events, the American and French revolutions. Both were like high-octane fuel thrown onto the fire of progress, and Britain, the ever-aloof aristocrat, couldn't help but feel the heat. The revolutions were about as welcome in the halls of British power as a bull in a china shop, and yet they were impossible to ignore. In this volatile climate, Wilberforce's crusade looked less like a quaint moral campaign and more like a radical revolutionary act. Let's talk about 789, a year that was less about sipping tea and more about spilling it. This was when Wilberforce made one of the most significant parliamentary speeches of his career. Picture the scene, the House of Commons, filled with men in powdered wigs and waistcoats, each trying to look more important than the last. Wilberforce took the floor, and with the kind of oratory that could make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, he laid bare the moral bankruptcy of the slave trade. It wasn't just a speech, it was a verbal cannonball, aimed squarely at the heart of Britain's economic juggernaut. Now, before you get swept away by the romance of this lone hero moment, let's set the record straight. Wilberforce was not some solitary knight tilting at windmills. No, he was more like the front man of a band, charismatic, yes, but backed by a talented ensemble. The Clapham sect, a group of evangelical Christians with a penchant for social reform, were his steadfast allies. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes, crafting strategies, gathering evidence, and lobbying like their lives depended on it. This wasn't just Wilberforce's fight. It was a collective effort, a symphony of voices all playing in harmony, albeit with the occasional discordant note. The abolitionist movement was a strategic masterpiece, akin to chess, where each move had to be calculated with precision. Remember, this was the 18th century. There was no Twitter to drum up outrage or Reddit to rally the masses. Instead, they relied on the good old quill and parchment, churning out pamphlets like a pre-industrial printing press on Red Bull. These pamphlets were the memes of their day, spreading awareness and stoking the fires of public opinion. Wilberforce and his allies also orchestrated what might be called the first viral campaign, a nationwide petition. In 1792, over 300,000 signatures were collected, a staggering number considering they couldn't just click a box online. People from all walks of life added their names, from the well-heeled gentry to the working-class masses. It was a demonstration of public will that no politician could afford to ignore, not if they valued their seat in Parliament more than their morning crumpet. But let's not sugarcoat this too much. The political landscape was a minefield, and Wilberforce had to navigate it with the finesse of a tightrope walker. The pro-slavery faction was formidable, with its members clutching their ledgers like lifelines. The sugar and cotton industries were the lifeblood of Britain's economy, and the thought of abolishing the slave trade sent shivers down the spines of those who profited from human misery. Wilberforce's opponents were well-funded, well-connected, and ruthless, ready to pounce on any misstep with the ferocity of a tabloid journalist. Despite this, Wilberforce pressed on, his resolve unshaken. His speeches became legendary, not just for their eloquence but for their emotional heft. He wielded facts like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting through the layers of apathy and greed to reveal the raw, ugly truth beneath. In one memorable speech, he implored his fellow MPs to imagine the suffering of the enslaved, asking them to consider what it meant to deny another human being their dignity and freedom. It was a rhetorical masterclass, a gut punch that left even the most hardened cynics momentarily speechless. However, it wasn't all grand speeches and moral triumphs. Behind the scenes, Wilberforce and his allies were engaged in the kind of political maneuvering that would make a Machiavellian strategist blush. They had to broker deals, make concessions, and occasionally swallow their ideals to keep the abolitionist cause alive. It was a delicate dance, one misstep away from disaster, and yet it was the only way to inch closer to their goal. The economic backdrop of this crusade was as murky as the Thames on a foggy morning. Britain was riding high on the profits of empire, with the slave trade as one of its most lucrative enterprises. The abolitionists had to convince not just the politicians but the public that the moral cost outweighed the financial gain. They argued that a nation built on the principles of liberty and justice could not, in good conscience, perpetuate such a heinous institution. It was a hard sell, like convincing a cat to take a bath, but Wilberforce's conviction was contagious. While Wilberforce was the face of the movement, it was the combined efforts of countless individuals that turned the tide. Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, Olaudah Equiano, names that deserve to be etched in the annals of history alongside Wilberforce's. Clarkson, for instance, travelled thousands of miles across Britain, gathering evidence and testimonials from those who had witnessed the horrors of the slave trade firsthand. His meticulous documentation provided the hard evidence needed to sway the undecided and silence the skeptics. And then there were the women, often overlooked in historical narratives, but crucial to the cause. Figures like Hannah More used their pens to wage war, crafting poems and essays that pierced the public consciousness. These women organized boycotts of slave-produced goods, proving that consumer power was a force to be reckoned with. They were the unsung heroines, their contributions as vital as any parliamentary speech. As the 1790s rolled on, the abolitionists faced setbacks and triumphs, their progress often as unpredictable as the British weather. The French Revolution, with its cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité, added a layer of complexity to the political landscape. The British elite, watched their French counterparts meet the guillotine with a mix of horror and fascination, wary of any reforms that might tip the balance of power too far. Yet, the revolution's ideals seeped into British society, fueling the fire of reform and giving Wilberforce's cause an added sense of urgency. Despite the odds, the movement gained momentum, and by the turn of the century, the abolition of the slave trade was no longer a distant dream but an achievable reality. It was a testament to the power of perseverance and the unwavering belief that justice, though slow in coming, was inevitable. Wilberforce and his allies had lit a spark that would eventually ignite a blaze of change, transforming not just laws but the very fabric of society. And so, the story of Wilberforce's abolitionist crusade continues, a saga of courage, conviction, and collaboration. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, but the groundwork had been laid, and the momentum was unstoppable. The next chapter awaited, promising more twists, turns, and triumphs in the relentless pursuit of justice. Stay tuned, because history was far from done with William Wilberforce and his remarkable band of reformers. As the abolitionist movement picked up steam, Wilberforce and his merry band of reformers found themselves in a political landscape as treacherous as a Regency-era ballroom floor after a particularly boisterous soiree. The late 1790s were a time of both heady optimism and crushing defeat, where the path to justice seemed to twist and turn with the unpredictability of a politician's promise. Let's dive into one of the more comically frustrating aspects of this journey, the seemingly endless debates in the British Parliament. Picture a room filled with men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Gainsborough painting, powdered wigs perched precariously atop their heads, each one convinced of their own importance. The air was thick with the smell of snuff and self-righteousness, as MPs like Wilberforce took to the floor to argue the abolitionist case. It was less a dignified debate and more a verbal sparring match, with each side hurling words like Victorian Twitter warriors. Wilberforce had to contend with opponents who wielded economic arguments like cudgels. They insisted that the British economy would crumble without the slave trade, painting doomsday scenarios where the empire would be reduced to rubble, its people forced to subsist on porridge and despair. They conveniently forgot that Britain's wealth was built on more than just human misery. Industry and innovation were burgeoning forces that could, with a little moral tweaking, lead to prosperity without chains. Despite the opposition's dire warnings, Wilberforce pressed on. He was no stranger to defeat. In fact, he had a collection of failed bills that could wallpaper a Westminster corridor. Each year, he'd introduce another abolition bill, and each year it was swatted down by the pro-slavery faction like a bothersome fly at a picnic. But Wilberforce wasn't deterred by these setbacks. If anything, they fueled his resolve, each defeat a reminder that he was on the right side of history, even if history seemed to be taking its sweet time catching up. In these parliamentary skirmishes, Wilberforce's resilience was legendary. He possessed a kind of stubborn optimism that would make a Labrador look cynical, and while his speeches were often met with eye rolls and yawns from his opponents, they were also peppered with moments of brilliance that could silence a room. Take, for instance, his 1791 address, where he calmly dismantled the economic arguments for slavery with all the precision of a watchmaker, citing figures and facts that left his adversaries scrambling for retorts. Behind the scenes, Wilberforce's allies worked tirelessly to chip away at the pro-slavery bloc's influence. The Clapham sect, with their potent mix of piety and pragmatism, were instrumental in shifting public opinion. They understood that while Parliament was the battleground, the war would be won in the court of public opinion. The abolitionists launched a series of campaigns that made the most of the era's communication tools. Pamphlets, public meetings, and even sugar boycotts, urging the populace to reject products tainted by the sweat of enslaved labour. One of the more curious alliances formed in this struggle was with the Quakers. Known for their pacifism and plain dress, the Quakers were early proponents of abolition, having denounced slavery as a moral abomination long before it was fashionable. Their steadfast support provided a moral backbone to the movement, and their organizational skills proved invaluable in orchestrating petitions and gathering evidence. But let's not romanticize this too much. The path to abolition was littered with obstacles that would make even the most optimistic reformer question their sanity. There were moments when the abolitionists seemed on the verge of victory, only to have their hopes dashed by political machinations that would make a soap opera plot seem straightforward. The so-called old corruption of British politics was alive and well, with vested interests greasing palms and pulling strings to maintain the status quo. Wilberforce, however, had a secret weapon in his arsenal, his ability to form unlikely alliances. He understood that politics was as much about compromise as it was about conviction. Take his friendship with William Pitt the Younger, for instance. Pitt was a Tory and Wilberforce a reformer, yet their shared history and mutual respect allowed them to collaborate on critical issues. It was a relationship that baffled many, akin to a cat and a dog putting aside their differences to chase the same ball. The economic arguments against abolition were formidable, yet Wilberforce and his allies countered with a vision of a different kind of prosperity. They pointed to the burgeoning industries of the Industrial Revolution, highlighting the potential for economic growth that didn't rely on human bondage. It was a bold vision, one that required a leap of faith from a nation accustomed to the profits of slavery. But Wilberforce's unwavering belief in humanity's capacity for change was contagious, inspiring others to imagine a future free from the shackles of the past. The late 1790s also saw a shift in public sentiment as horror stories of the Middle Passage and the brutal realities of plantation life began to seep into the British consciousness. Abolitionists cleverly used these narratives to tug at the heartstrings of the public, presenting slavery not as an abstract economic issue, but as a moral crisis that demanded action. The growing awareness of these atrocities helped to galvanize support for the cause, turning the tide in favor of abolition. Yet, for every small victory, there were setbacks that tested the movement's resilience. Political rivalries often reared their ugly heads, with MPs more concerned with scoring points against their adversaries than with the plight of enslaved individuals. The debates in Parliament occasionally devolved into farce, with MPs engaging in petty squabbles and personal attacks that would be more at home in a schoolyard than in the halls of power. One particularly amusing episode involved an MP who, in the heat of debate, accused Wilberforce of being a meddlesome do-gooder, as if that was the worst insult one could hurl. Wilberforce, never one to back down, retorted with a quip that left the chamber in stitches, deftly turning the insult into a badge of honour. It was this combination of wit and tenacity that made Wilberforce such a formidable opponent, able to disarm even the most curmudgeonly of critics with a well-timed joke. As the turn of the century approached, the abolitionists found themselves on the cusp of a breakthrough. The momentum they had built over the years was finally beginning to pay off, with more MPs coming around to the idea that perhaps, just perhaps, slavery wasn't the cornerstone of civilization it was made out to be. But the fight was far from over, and the road ahead promised more twists and turns than a Dickens novel. Wilberforce's resilience in the face of repeated defeats was a testament to his character and conviction. He understood that true change was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was willing to endure the setbacks and small victories alike on the path to justice. It was a lesson in perseverance, one that resonates even today, reminding us that while the arc of history may be long, it bends toward justice only through the tireless efforts of those who refuse to give up. As the dawn of the 19th century loomed on the horizon, Wilberforce and his allies stood poised to make history. The winds of change were blowing, and the abolitionists were ready to seize the moment, armed with the knowledge that their cause was just and their resolve unbreakable. The stage was set for the next chapter in this extraordinary saga, a tale of courage, conviction, and the relentless pursuit of a better world. Stay tuned, because Wilberforce's journey is far from over, and the best is yet to come. As the new century unfurled its wings, the abolitionist movement found itself in a position as precarious as a tightrope walker on a windy day. With every step, the stakes rose higher, but so did the momentum, fueled by an unyielding desire for change. By 1807, a tipping point was reached, and it was time for the abolitionists to cash in on years of sweat, strategy, and stubborn tenacity. Enter the Slave Trade Act of 1807, the legislative pièce de résistance that finally put the kibosh on Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. It was a victory as hard-won as it was overdue, a triumph that felt like crossing the finish line of a marathon with blisters the size of golf balls. On March 25th, the Act received royal assent, marking a pivotal moment in history that was as much about the collective effort of countless individuals as it was about Wilberforce's singular dedication. It's tempting to paint Wilberforce as the lone hero, valiantly slaying the dragon of slavery with a flick of his quill, but that would be giving him far too much credit. Sure, his name was on the marquee, but the real story is more ensemble cast than solo performance. The Clapham Sect, Thomas Clarkson, Olaudah Equiano, Hannah More. The list of contributors reads like the credits of a blockbuster film, each playing a vital role in the movement's success. This wasn't a one-man show. It was a symphony of voices, each adding their unique note to the crescendo of change. Yet, let's not downplay Wilberforce's role either. His relentless campaigning, spanning over 2 decades, was crucial in keeping the issue of abolition on the political radar. He was the poster boy for persistence, even when his health faltered under the weight of his convictions. The man suffered from debilitating illnesses, including ulcerative colitis, a condition that would have most of us curled up in bed with a hot water bottle, not battling the political elite. But Wilberforce's commitment was such that he soldiered on, fueled by a belief stronger than his physical ailments. To truly understand Wilberforce's legacy, one must consider the personal sacrifices he made for the cause. His political career, once a playground for youthful missteps, became a crucible of moral purpose. While his contemporaries revelled in the social whirl, Wilberforce dedicated himself to a cause that seemed, at times, Sisyphean. His personal life took a back seat to his political mission, and it's worth noting that he remained unmarried until he was 37, a veritable bachelor in a society that valued early matrimonial alliances. But before we get too misty-eyed, let's inject a dose of reality. Wilberforce wasn't a saintly figure devoid of flaws. He was a product of his time, privileged, sometimes paternalistic, and not immune to the biases of his era. The romanticized image of Wilberforce as a pure-hearted crusader overlooks the complexities of his character. He was, after all, a politician, and like all politicians, he knew the art of compromise. He navigated the choppy waters of political alliances with the deftness of a seasoned sailor, more pragmatist than purist. The abolitionist victory was a testament to the power of collective action, a reminder that no single person, however charismatic, can change the world alone. It was the combined efforts of activists, writers, and ordinary citizens that turned the tide, a grassroots movement that demonstrated the power of public will. The abolition of the slave trade wasn't just a triumph of moral righteousness, it was a strategic win, the result of savvy political maneuvering and relentless public pressure. Economically, the Act of 1807 was a gamble, a leap of faith into the unknown. The British economy had long been intertwined with the profits of slavery, and the abolitionists had to convince a nation that prosperity could be achieved without chains. It was a bold vision, one that required a recalibration of economic priorities and a shift in the moral compass of a nation. The abolitionists argued that a country poised on the brink of industrial revolution could thrive through innovation rather than exploitation. Yet, the Slave Trade Act was just the beginning. The abolition of the trade didn't equate to the abolition of slavery itself, a distinction as crucial as it was frustrating. The fight to end slavery outright would continue for decades, culminating in the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, a testament to the tenacity of those who refused to rest on their laurels. Wilberforce continued to campaign for full abolition until his death in 1833, just 3 days after hearing that the act would be passed. It was a poetic end to a life dedicated to justice, a reminder that the wheels of progress may turn slowly, but they do indeed turn. So, what do we make of Wilberforce's legacy? Was he a hero or a flawed human who did heroic things? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. He was a man who, despite his privileged upbringing, chose to fight for those who had no voice, a testament to the power of personal conviction. But he was also emblematic of the collective spirit that defines all great movements, a reminder that the fight for justice is never a solo endeavour. As we reflect on Wilberforce's life and the abolitionist movement, we're reminded of the messy, complicated reality of history. It's a tale of triumph and tragedy, of individuals and collectives, of romance and reality. The success of the abolitionist movement was a beacon of hope, a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the impact of collective action, and the enduring legacy of those who dare to dream of a better world. And so, we close the book on William Wilberforce, a man who dared to challenge the status quo, whose legacy is a tapestry of triumphs and trials. His story is a reminder that history is not just a series of events, but a living, breathing narrative shaped by the actions of those who came before us. As we forge our own paths in an ever-changing world, let us carry forward the lessons of the past, remembering that while the journey may be fraught with challenges, the destination, justice, equality and freedom, is worth every step.